This is the tale of what for me was a rather remarkable adventure. It was assembled on the basis of my personal recollection and experience, emails, GPS logs and some official documents. It represents solely the perspective and opinions of myself, in my more lucid moments. It is in no way intended to represent the position of the Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit, nor any other agency mentioned. Further, my usual writing style tends to be somewhat lighthearted and flippant, which would be somewhat at odds with the serious and tragic nature of the incident being reported. I have attempted to remain sensitive to the underlying events, yet retain a certain level of casual narrative that some might find entertaining. And if not entertaining, then at least informative. As part of due diligence, I need to add an important note. In the past, I've kept certain locations regarding this incident fairly well cloaked for a variety of reasons, explained as part of the narrative. Mainly, it's a very difficult, even dangerous, area to get into, and there are a lot of armchair desert adventurers possibly tempted to try it. However, in the interest of completeness, I've decided to include images showing the GPS tracks of the various search efforts. I've also refrained from my favorite trick of photo reversing images of the site. What you see at what it was. At this point, there is nothing left at the site for souvenir hunters, so I see no need for maintaining its secrecy. Anyone reading of the difficulties encountered in this search should consider any visitation very carefully. As a point of reference, if you're not physically capable of doing a day hike to the top of Mount Whitney and back, and aren't a skilled, off-trail hiker, you should stay out of this area. My opinion, anyway. That's a measure of how hard it is to get into the area on foot, and out, safely. At this point I know the location and surroundings probably better than anyone, and I'm not going back. The area scares me just a bit. In the morning of October 21, 1996, Death Valley National Park, DVNP, Ranger Dave Brenner was aboard a military helicopter somewhere in the skies over the southerly part of Death Valley. He was part of a routine aerial surveillance looking for clandestine drug manufacturing labs in the backcountry. Around 11 a.m., he saw something unexpected, a vehicle in the wash of Anvil Canyon, approximately 2.4 miles downstream from Willow Spring, the head of Anvil Canyon. This was extremely odd for several reasons. First, there wasn't a real or legal road down Anvil Canyon any longer. At one time Anvil Canyon had been the only route into Butte Valley, and used by the area's miners. But with the opening of the talc mines in Warm Spring Canyon to the north, and the creation of a good, well-graded dirt road to the talc mines for heavy trucks, the Butte Valley miners pushed an extension of the Warm Spring Road westward into Butte Valley, and the Anvil Canyon route relegated to a seldom-used byway. Then, in October of 1994, with the passage of the Desert Protection Act, Anvil Canyon was designated as part of an official wilderness area, thus prohibiting vehicle use in it. Not that the few locals seemed to adhere to the prohibition, as Anvil Canyon still received occasional, if illicit, use. The second piece of oddness in what Brenner was observing was that the vehicle appeared to be a standard passenger van. While Anvil Canyon could still be traveled by a competent four-wheel drive vehicle, if illegally, a passenger van was totally inappropriate and couldn't be expected to get far in that canyon. Yet there it was. Upon landing nearby, Brenner inspected the vehicle. It was a green, 1996 Plymouth Voyager van with California license plates. It was covered with considerable dust, as if it had been out there for some time. The van was clearly stuck in the wash, sunk up to its axles in the sand, with its two rear tires flattened and its left front tire also flat. Tracks left in the sand by the van suggested it had been driven at least 200 with flat rear tires. The van was locked, with no sign of the owner. Brenner noted the license number and reported it back to the DVNP headquarters. A quick check on the license plate with the California Highway Patrol, CHP, revealed the vehicle was reported stolen by the Los Angeles Police Department on September 10, 1996. The vehicle, owned by Dollar Rent-A-Car, had been rented to a group of 4 German tourists in Los Angeles on July 8, 1996. The vehicle had been due back to the rental agency in Los Angeles on July 26, but had never been returned. It was the rental agency's policy to wait at least 30 days past when a vehicle was due to report it stolen. Checking the names of the renters turned up an August 14 Interpol alert on them. They were Egbert Rimkus, 34, his son Georg Weber, 11, Egbert's girlfriend Cornelia Meyer, 28, and her son Max Meyer, 4. Further investigation showed the group left Frankfurt and arrived in the United States at Seattle on July 8, then immediately flew to Los Angeles where they picked up their rental van. Because Egbert could not produce his driver's license, Cornelia was recorded as the driver. The van was due back on July 26 and the group had tickets on TWA to return to Germany on July 27. They were not on that flight, nor was there evidence of them leaving the USA. For the first week or so in the USA, the Germans based themselves in the San Clemente area of Southern California, doing normal tourist things. On July 12, Egbert made a call to his bank in Dresden requesting $1,500 be wired to a Bank of America branch in San Clemente. The money ended up being sent to a Bank of America branch in Los Angeles. At this point their travels become a bit vague, but the images on their recovered cameras suggest they traveled the California coast a bit, before ending up in Las Vegas and staying at the Treasure Island Hotel. On July 21, Egbert faxed a request from the hotel to his ex-wife and son's mother, Heike Weber, requesting additional funds be sent to him. These funds were never sent. The party checked out of the Treasure Island Hotel on July 22, and proceeded to Death Valley. Receipt records at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center show that on July 22, 2 copies of the booklet, Death Valley National Monument Museum text in the German language were sold. None were sold on July 23. A copy of this booklet was found in the abandoned van, which places the group at the DV Visitor Center sometime on July 22. Meanwhile, back at the van in Anvil Canyon, an investigation and search was beginning in earnest. On October 22, the day after the van's discovery, around 10 a.m., DVNP investigator Eric Inman was flown in via CHP helicopter to the site. He performed an initial search and photographed the location. Other than Dave Brenner's tracks from the previous day, no other footprints were visible. Some food wrappers were found near the van, as well as some fecal material and toilet paper, cat holes. At 11 a.m., Inman returned via the CHP helicopter to Badwater Road in Death Valley where he met with representatives of the Inyo Sheriff's Office, Detective Jim Jones and Corporal Leon Boyer. Following discussion, the Inyo Sheriff's personnel proceeded to the van's location via vehicle and Inman was flown back in around 1 p.m. With Sheriff's personnel present, Inman opened the van's doors and an examination of its contents began. While there were many items of interest, of particular note was an American flag labeled Butte Valley Stone Cabin. This cabin, also known as the Geologist's Cabin, is located in Butte Valley 4.1 miles westerly from the van's location in Anvil Canyon. This cabin is a comfortable shelter, somewhat stocked with food, with a good source of water adjacent to it, Anvil Spring. The flag had apparently been taken from the cabin and indicated the party had been to the cabin at some point. Some other items of note found in the van: 2 unopened bottles of beer, Bud Ice, and 1 empty bottle. 1 empty and 1 3/4 full bottle of bourbon. Several empty large water and juice containers. Luggage and clothing. Numerous exposed rolls of 35mm film and a Praktica 35mm camera. 1 new Coleman sleeping bag in its box and 1 empty Coleman sleeping bag box. A tent. A pipe with tobacco. A leather card carrier containing Swiss bank cards and a Citicorp card for Egbert. Card from the Seahorse Resort in San Clemente. Numerous toys. An unused compact spare tire and jack. Under the direction of the Inyo Sheriff's Office, the van was removed from Anvil Canyon on October 23 at about 2 p.m. by Miller's Towing of Lone Pine, and stored at their impound lot. Back at park headquarters, a review of visitor logbooks routinely collected by field rangers turned up a valuable clue. The visitor logbook for the Warm Spring Mine site, located on the route between the Main Valley and Butte Valley, had an apparent entry by the group. Although difficult to read, on July 23, it states in German, "We are going over the pass," and was signed, Connie, Egbert, Georg, Max. The pass referred to in the logbook entry was almost certainly Mengel Pass, located a few miles from Anvil Canyon at the southwesterly end of Butte Valley, and the only means by which to cross the Panamint mountain range for many miles. However, it is an extremely rugged route, traversable by only the most competent Ford WD vehicle and driver. It would be impassable for a vehicle such as the Germans were driving. Further investigation showed that the party had not stayed at the Furnace Creek Ranch or Inn, the Stovepipe Wells Resort, nor had registered at the Furnace Creek Campground. Their whereabouts between being at the DVNP Visitor Center on July 22 and signing the Warm Spring Log Book on July 23 were unknown at the time. On October 23 at 10 a.m., the first searchers were in place. They included the China Lake Mountain Rescue Group, CLMRG, 9 trackers from the Indian Wells Valley Search and Rescue Group and 8 mounted units from the Kern County Sheriff's Mounted Search and Rescue. On this day, members of the CLMRG found a Bud Ice beer bottle planted in the sand in Anvil Canyon, adjacent to a bush approximately 1.7 miles downstream, easterly, from the van's location. The bottle matched those found in the van. It appeared a ledge had been brushed clear of rocks, and someone left a large seat print next to the bottle. The placement of the sitting spot, on the easterly side of the bush, suggested it was to shade from a late afternoon sun. This clue was to be the first and last found in the initial search. The area searched this day covered much of Anvil Canyon from the van easterly to its mouth at the Warm Spring Road. Day 2 of the search, October 24, brought additional teams and expanded the search area. In addition to CLMRG, Indian Wells and the Kern County mounted teams already on site, SAR teams arrived from Nye County, Nevada, and Inyo County. Areas searched this day included more of Anvil Canyon, portions of Warm Spring Road and Butte Valley, Mengle Pass, the area adjacent to Warm Spring Road between the canyon mouth and West Side Road, and from the van location easterly to the head of Anvil Canyon at Willow Spring. There were also 2 helicopters involved this day, both for searching and shuttling supplies and searchers. Day 3 of the search, October 25, expanded it even further. A team from DVNP searched the area between the mouth of Anvil Canyon and the far side of the main valley at Badwater Road. A SAR team from Victorville searched the southeasterly perimeters of Butte Valley. A BLM ranger began a search of the route on the west side of Mengle Pass, between Ballarat and Barker Ranch. A team from Lake Mead NP searched from Anvil Canyon northerly, over the mountains and down into Butte Valley. The Indian Wells team did an intensive search around Willow Spring, at the head of Anvil Canyon. CLMRG started from the middle of Anvil Canyon, then went north, then westerly. The same 2 helicopters were still at work shuttling supplies and searchers, as well as searching. The 4th day of the search, October 26, was the final day. The DVNP team checked areas northerly of Warm Spring Canyon as well as mine areas a lost person might have sought shelter in. The Victorville team performed searching around Striped Butte in Butte Valley. The Lake Mead team also checked Striped Butte, as well as walking the Warm Spring Canyon Road. The BLM ranger on the west side of Mengle Pass continued searching that area, as well as other possible routes the party may have used if traveling westerly towards Ballarat. The Indian Wells team searched the vicinity of Warm Spring Road and West Side Road when some footprints had been found. A vehicle SAR team from Apple Valley, new to the search, searched areas along West Side Road from Warm Spring Canyon Road northerly, where a party may have sought shelter. Finally, aerial reconnaissance was made via 2 helicopters in all quadrants surrounding Anvil Canyon, including south, but was hampered by high winds. At the end of the day, with no new clues found since the beer bottle on the first day, and no hope whatsoever that the party would be found alive, the search was called off. This was truly a massive search performed by very competent search teams. The CLMRG people alone are some of the best in this part of the country. There were over 45 searchers in the field and 2 helicopters in the air at any given time and 8 horses on the ground. Costs for the search were approximately $80,000 in 1996 dollars. It was estimated by a DVNP spokesperson that 250 people were involved in the search at one time or another. The areas searched were well reasoned and a high probability of success was expected. Unfortunately, even a high probability is not a guarantee. In the years since 1996, numerous additional searches were made, some by search and rescue teams, some by private groups. CLMRG in particular made a number of trips back to search additional areas and examine mine shafts. Searches by private groups tended to be more informal and less is known of them. 2 of the more prominent individuals in this area include Dick Hasselman, a retired professor at Virginia Tech, and Emmett Harder, who had prospected in the Butte Valley area for many years. Both had conducted at least several searches in the area and wrote reports of their findings. Aside from these occasional searches, things remained calm and peaceful in Anvil Canyon. During his involvement with this incident, Emmett Harder had been granted access by the Inyo Sheriff's Office to view the pictures recovered from the Germans' camera. Due to his familiarity with the area, he recognized a sunset picture, looking easterly down into the main valley as having been taken in Hanaupa Canyon, located about 17 miles northerly of Warm Spring Canyon. Given the presence of the Germans at the DV Visitors Center on July 22, and their Warm Spring log book entry of July 23, this suggests the Germans made camp in the upper reaches of Hanaupa Canyon the night of July 22. A couple of environmental conditions at the time of the incident are worth mentioning. Death Valley in summer can be a formidable experience, especially backcountry travel. Even experienced desert travelers with well-equipped vehicles may give second thought to such an idea. At the time the Germans vanished in Anvil Canyon, the following temperatures were recorded near the park headquarters at Furnace Creek. However, due to the higher elevation of Anvil Canyon, the temperatures were somewhat more moderate. In dry conditions such Death Valley, the air temperature typically drops approximately 5.4 F, 3.05 C, for every 1,000 in altitude gained, the dry adiabatic lapse rate. At the van's location of approximately 3,100, it would have been about 17 F, 9.5 C, cooler than Furnace Creek. Thus the high temperature at the van's location on July 23 would have been about 107 F, 42 C, and the low around 79 F, 26 C. The other environmental condition is the phase and rise/set times of the moon. On July 23, 1996, the moon's phase would have been technically that of a first quarter. This means the moon's disk was half lit and half dark. It would be best described as a half moon. Moonrise would have been at 1:24 p.m. and the moon would not have set until 12:34 a.m. on July 24, thus providing light past midnight. However, due to the higher elevation of Anvil Canyon, the temperatures were somewhat more moderate. In dry conditions such as Death Valley, the air temperature typically drops approximately 5.4 F, 3.05 C, for every 1,000 in altitude gained, the dry adiabatic lapse rate. At the van's location of approximately 3,100, it would have been about 17 F, 9.5 C, cooler than Furnace Creek. Thus the high temperature at the van's location on July 23 would have been about 107 F, 42 C, and the low around 79 F, 26 C. The other environmental condition is the phase and rise/set times of the moon. On July 23, 1996, the moon's phase would have been technically that of a first quarter. This means the moon's disk was half lit and half dark. It would be best described as a half moon. Moonrise would have been at 1:24 p.m. and the moon would not have set until 12:34 a.m. on July 24, thus providing light past midnight. I first came across the story of the missing Germans sometime in the summer of 2008. While romping around the interwebs, between piano-playing cats and oceans of porn, I saw references to the tale on a Death Valley forum. It sounded interesting, so I googled a bit more and came across a report the CLMRG had done for their newsletter, The Tailless Pile. The newsletter item laid out the basics of the case, but not much more. I was intrigued, but was quickly diverted by more piano-playing cats. Still, it remained in the back of my mind and was one of the two cases that got me seriously interested in the search and rescue field. The other was Steve Fawcett. After joining the Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit, RMRU, in February of 2009, I actively began seeking out whatever training I could find. One opportunity I came across was a 2-half-day course on man-tracking in Ridgecrest at the end of September, 2009. I know man-tracking sounds a bit ominous, but it just involves learning to follow the tracks of people rather than animals. That skill comes in handy in SAR operations. The class was being hosted by the CLMRG and I knew a lot of their members would be in attendance. This was a great opportunity to ask more about the Germans case. I had now been in SAR long enough to know that there are often details to incidents that don't make it into general circulation, and many times there is much more to the story. The missing German struck me as a case that simply had to have more to it. After making an inquiry or two, I was told, "Oh, you need to talk to Debbie Breitenstein. She's obsessed with it. She was on the original search and is all the background." In my world, obsessed is good, so this looked promising. Due to class activities, I wasn't able to connect with Debbie until almost the end of the class, which was at a barbecue held at her home. Ever suave with opening lines, I think I started with something to the effect of, "So, tell me about the missing Death Valley Germans." Debbie at first appeared a little reluctant to get into the subject, as if she didn't want to dump an avalanche of information on me. But my obnoxious persistence and the thought that someone else actually was interested in the topic finally got her going. Beyond getting a much more detailed rundown of the incident, I found out two major points of information. The first was that Debbie had much of the original documentation of the search in her possession. The second was that unlike many cases, there really wasn't more to it than met the eye. The basic information of the case I was already aware of was all there really was. This only added to the mystery. Debbie also mentioned the names of two private individuals who had performed some searching and written reports of their efforts, Emmett Harder and Dick Hasselman. She said she thought their reports might still be available online. Returning home, I swung into data collection mode. Ignoring my usual diversions of lawkits, I scoured the internet for even the slightest mention of the Germans, as well as the Harder and Hasselman reports. I was able to find a few bits, but the two reports I was after eluded me. Seeing Dick Hasselman being referred to as a retired professor from Virginia Tech, I was able to track down his university email and send him a query. After a bit of back and forth, he sent me a hard copy of his latest version. In terms of factual events, it displayed the accuracy typically seen in academic work, which was refreshing. And he had also spent considerable time interviewing the relatives of the Germans back in Germany, attempting to develop a profile of the group. This, however, left me a bit uneasy. It's well known in the SAR field that relatives are notoriously poor in describing even such simple things as what a subject was wearing when last seen. To ask them to describe a subject's state of mind or intent, years after an event, is just asking to be led down wrong paths. So while I found much of his work spot on, my experience caused me to weigh the data points differently and ultimately found many of his conclusions improbable. Hasselman did bring up a couple of possible new clues I had not been aware of. First, there was a story of an individual on an ATV finding a couple of German canteens in an area described as being the midpoint of a straight line drawn bin Sugarloaf and Needle Peak. This would have been about 3.5 miles southeasterly of the van's location. As riding an ATV off-road in a national park was not something authorities smiled upon, getting details of this alleged event was difficult. The second possible clue mentioned by Hasselman was that in the 3-month period between when the Germans apparently became stuck and when the van was discovered, a ranger on patrol about 18 miles to the south found an abandoned sleeping bag in the middle of a remote dirt road. As there was a sleeping bag from the van unaccounted for, could this possibly be connected? Unfortunately, not yet aware of the Germans who were at that time missing in Anvil Canyon, DVNP disposed of the sleeping bag as trash, so it could never be examined as evidence. I found this second clue very intriguing, due to a personal connection. Oddly, my wife Jerry and I had done a hiking trip in the very area the sleeping bag was found in March of 1996, only 4 months before the Germans became trapped. The road where the bag was found is rugged and extremely remote, ending at a microwave relay tower at time owned by AT&T. I knew the road and I knew the tower and thought it could have been a landmark a lost person might move toward. I also knew there was nothing much else to be seen in the area, as it's against the northerly edges of the China Lake Naval Weapons Center boundary. And covering a straight line distance of 18 miles in the heat of July seemed highly unlikely. Tracking down Emmett Harder's report eventually led me to a visit to his home in Devore, California on October 21st. We spoke for almost 4 hours about the case, the people involved and the general area of Death Valley. He also provided me with a copy of his report, Cauldron of Hellfire, as well as a copy of the DV Investigator's report by Eric Inman, and several other useful documents. I asked him about the German canteens that Hasselman said were supposedly found to the south, between Sugarloaf and Needle Peaks. Harder had some detail on this, as well as knowing and talking to the motorcyclist was who supposedly found them. But he didn't put too much weight on it, as the individual was unable to actually produce the canteens and the responses were less than satisfactory in Harder's opinion. Further, Harder later found out there was a food/water cache placed in the same general area for a group of long-distance hikers/survivalists traveling from Battle Mountain, Nevada to the Salton Sea. The party ended up missing their cache, and so it would have remained in place, and any canteens could be related to that. During all this I continued to pester Debbie for more information, and despite her work commitments she obliged, and more data kept flowing my way. Incident logs, clue lists, all sorts of wonderful stuff. In reviewing it I was impressed with the quality and thoroughness of the previous searching done by the various SAR teams. It became obvious to me that there were certain areas that, looking back in hindsight, could probably be excluded as they had been rigorously searched. Amazingly, this could be said of all of Anvil Canyon, most of Butte Valley, as well as Warm Spring Canyon. In essence, every place the Germans should have gone had been thoroughly searched with no trace found. This was certainly a strange case. Yet 4 people can't simply vanish into thin, if somewhat hot, air. This is probably the reason so many wild ideas as to their fate appeared over the years. The vacuum of solid information was slowly filled with wild speculation. Perhaps now might be a good time to list some of the ideas out there and editorialize a bit. Probably the most popular explanation as to what became of the Germans is that they staged the incident to disappear and start new lives. This was given some momentum by Egbert's ex-wife saying there were custody issues with their son. Also, co-workers of Egbert stated he talked about moving to Costa Rica, which was rumored to have provided some sort of legal shelter if he brought his son along. As I said, this was a popular scenario. Even some SAR members and DVNP staff thought it possible. But really, if you wanted to stage a disappearance, why do it in a dangerous and remote environment like Death Valley in summer? It could have been just as effective and much simpler to have done such a thing while in Las Vegas. Further, Cornelia had a thriving business back in Germany which required her attention upon her return. She was in no position to vanish. Another idea floating around was that Egbert was intent on penetrating the China Lake NWC facility in the hopes of seeing exotic technology. There were a lot of vague, long after the fact reports from relatives that he had heard of a very secret facility near Death Valley and was obsessed with finding out more. Further, he supposedly had some involvement in hybrid propulsion, whatever that means, and variants of this scenario either had the group forcibly conscripted into a black US government program, or more sinisterly, they saw something they weren't supposed to see and were eliminated by US government black world operatives. I suppose my background gives me the advantage of easily seeing the level of nonsense in this theory. I was quite involved in the amazing social fad in the mid-1990s that swirled around the facility at Groom Lake, better known as Area 51. I knew all the major players and spent considerable time unraveling many of its mysteries. Given that era in time, I am certain any reference to a secret facility near Death Valley, especially by a European, was a reference to Area 51 and not China Lake. No offense to China Lake, as I'm sure they have some rather interesting and overlooked things of their own, but there was nothing there to pull in tourists from Germany, and certainly nothing to be inadvertently observed that would make someone disappear. Further, my background also includes graduate work and research in what could best be labeled exotic propulsion, including a few papers. So when someone starts tossing around phrases like hybrid propulsion, I'm qualified to weigh in. First, the phrase itself means nothing, but it suggests something exotic and otherworldly, which was probably the intent. But a Toyota Prius uses hybrid propulsion. Very cool, but nothing amazing. Further, investigating some of the names that Egbert was alleged to have worked with showed them to be designers of exotically styled automotive vehicles. Finally, if someone wanted to see into the China Lake facility and attempt to observe what's going on, there are far better and easier locations to do so. So the idea that the Germans were in that area at all to penetrate or observe the China Lake facility is fantasy. The last of the popular alternative theories as to what befell the Germans involved their crossing paths with some sort of criminal element. Some thought it could have been aging Charles Manson followers from the somewhat nearby Barker Ranch, or merely backcountry sociopaths. I have to admit, there is a possibility of this, but fortunately a very low one. The overwhelming majority of people who have made the effort to get into the backcountry are wonderful folks. This concept has the Germans crossing paths with one or more unsavory individuals, being killed, and their van dumped in Anvil Canyon to hide the crime. The question one must immediately ask is why? Egbert's bank cards were left in the van and not taken. No activity was ever recorded on Cornelia's cards. The van was left locked and no other vehicle tracks were seen. Why wasn't the van taken? It would have been the most valuable thing the Germans had. And then there was the empty beer bottle found well downstream from the van's location. The searchers did spend a lot of time looking for something that could have been a grave but failed. Finally, while bad guys might not be the swiftest people in the world, why would they be hanging around the backcountry of Death Valley in summer? Of course, there were also the even stranger ideas like alien abduction. When people seemingly vanish into thin air, everybody jumps to blame the aliens. It appears to be the explanation of last resort, and useful in almost any situation. But without going too far out on a limb, I think we can safely eliminate the possibility in this case. Given the lack of clues in this case, after time it became sort of a Rorschach test for searchers. People saw what they wanted to see as their minds attempted to form a conclusion. It's well known that the human mind desperately wants to connect cause and effect and will often craft answers when there are in fact none. I had now reached the point where I possessed all the information I was likely to obtain for the case. I had also spent many hours studying topo maps and Google Earth. I was beginning to seriously look at the area southerly of the van, primarily because it seemed to be the only area that hadn't been searched and the terrain didn't seem impossible. Problem was, there was no apparent reason for the party to head in that direction. The found beer bottle suggested they were heading eastward, toward the main valley. It was now time to head into the field and observe what things looked like for myself and see if there was any conceivable reason the Germans might want to have headed south. I decided on the perhaps not too bright course of action of making this a solo trip. I thought it important I see the area with fresh eyes, undistracted by company. My plan was to hike into Anvil Canyon, and perhaps linger in the canyon until after dark, coming out via headlamp and camping in my truck at the trailhead. I thought this could be useful as the moon's phase and rise/set times were similar to what was in effect when the Germans were there. I was interested to observe if there were any distant sky glows visible that could have enticed them into a specific direction, especially to the south. Let the adventure begin. On Tuesday, October 27th, I managed to get out of the house by 4:30 a.m., more asleep than awake. After the obligatory stop in beautiful Baker for gas and what passes for fine dining at a mini-mart, I made it to the head of Anvil Canyon about 10 a.m. A couple of things struck me about the trip in. First, I was surprised at how long it took to get from the pavement of Badwater Road into Butte Valley. It was about 1/2 stinkin' hours with no stopping or sightseeing. Second, I was also impressed by how bad the road becomes at places after passing Warm Spring. These sort of observations were precisely the reason I wanted to do this first trip alone. I wanted to look at this all as someone who has never seen it before, as the Germans had, and note what feelings/impressions I got. And the underlying impression was that this was one very remote place, and I hadn't even left the truck yet. I started off from the truck and down Anvil Canyon about 10 a.m. It was very windy and pretty cool, maybe 60 degrees. As I left the trailhead at Willow Spring, I noted there is no obvious way to know if there's really water present unless you go down and rummage through the brush. To a casual observer, it just looks like dense brush. On the way to the van's location, another observation, I was really amazed at how much burrow tracks look like human sneaker footprints. I could see how someone not knowing what they were could mistake them for fresh human tracks and maybe follow them. It appeared as if there was a deranged running club going up and down Anvil Canyon. Oh yeah, and I was struck by how sandy and loose the material was that comprised the road and the wash. Very easy to get a vehicle stuck. With the GPS coordinates, I made it to the van's location easily. There was a rock cairn present on the large rock near where the left front of the vehicle came to rest. I marked off the approximate outline of the van with flags and took photos to match those in the DVNP investigators' report. It was pretty obvious how they took a right fork when the road, such as it was, actually veered left and ended up in a no man's land. As I climbed up on the bank of the wash to the south to take overall pictures, it suddenly struck me that Egbert probably did the same thing and was at the same spot on the bank, to get an overview of where they were. It was a very eerie feeling. I continued on to the bottle site, which I started calling the bottle bush, coming across some old bones. They looked a bit large to be human, and I'd guess burrow. I took pictures and coordinates. The bones were later determined to be burrow. Finding the bottle bush was a little tricky. The coordinates I had from Debbie were rounded a bit, but close. I had printed out the two poor B&W prints I had of the location and was able to line up the background hills for a good match. There was only about a 100-foot area along the wash where the topography lined up. If I had better prints, it would have been easy to find the absolutely precise spot, but I was close enough. I did find what I thought to be the bottle bush, although the ground in front of it looked like it had been eroded a bit by flooding in the intervening years. I sat there a while and thought about where I was, what I was seeing, and took some panoramas of the view. The seating location obviously suggests shading from very late afternoon sun. Early in the day it would have been in direct sun, so I think that puts a general time of day on when it was used. At this point the wind had picked up much more and the weather was getting colder and weirder. The main valley was dusty enough that I could not see past the mouth of Anvil Canyon in the distance or to the other side of the main valley. There was a real milky-looking overcast that left me with an ominous feeling. Looking at the time, I was thinking I wouldn't be able to make it southerly past Squaw Spring, as I would have liked, and still make it back to my truck by 5. I had already decided I didn't want to be out hiking in Anvil Canyon after dark, as there wouldn't be much of a moon with the overcast. Also, being there solo, the history of the place and the weather was all making things more than a bit creepy for me. I decided I had time to poke a bit more down Anvil Canyon, then up to Squaw Spring. My maps showed an old road that ran from Anvil Canyon southwest up to Squaw Spring. As I traveled easterly down Anvil Canyon, I was looking for anything that might have enticed the Germans to head south. For most of the route that way was blocked by mountains, but near the Bottle Bush the topography to the south opened up, and I knew that Squaw Spring was up there somewhere. Having seen the burrow tracks, I was assembling a marvelous scenario in my mind where the Germans had also seen them and been led astray. My brilliant theory was that when they got to the bend in the road shown on my map that turns back to the right and heads southwesterly up to Squaw Spring, they may have seen burrow tracks heading up the road to the spring and thinking they were human, followed them to the south. Of course I knew that CLMRG had returned to the area on a later search and thoroughly explored the Squaw Spring area without luck. But I put that thought aside and was quite proud of my idea. Sadly, that idea was dashed when I reached the road bend. I use the term road in the loosest sense. The road up to the right was so faded it was almost invisible. I had it shown on my GPS map which saved me, and it was so rocky it couldn't possibly have shown burrow tracks. Nevertheless, I started up the road, climbing the alluvial fan toward Squaw Spring. Looking south, at this point I couldn't think of any conceivable reason they would have been drawn in that direction. While the terrain to the south looked milder, there was no obvious attraction to proceed that way. As I reached the ridge opposite Squaw Spring, an incongruous clump of green on the hillside, it was almost 3 p.m. and time to get the hell out of Dodge, so I really didn't get to poke in the shrubs at all. But as with Willow Spring, this was a case of not seeing obvious water. Now the road to Squaw Spring makes almost a 180 bend, so you end up going east down Anvil Canyon a ways, then backtrack up to Squaw Spring. To save distance and get out of this crazy place as quickly as possible, I decided to save time and just head cross-country almost straight back to the van, cutting off maybe 1/2 miles, and lots of walking in sand. It was an adventure, going up and down through ravines, and I saw some interesting stuff I wouldn't have otherwise seen. I came across a nice .50 caliber shell casing from 1943, a sure sign that I'm in an out-of-the-way place. I've found a great many of those out in the desert. By now the wind was howling, not quite yet bad enough for goggles, and the temperature had dropped to the mid-50s. I got back to the truck about 4:40 p.m., after covering a total of just over 12 miles for the day. As there was still light for about another hour, I decided I'd just try for home rather than spend a night with the truck rocking in the wind, not to mention being a little relieved to return to civilization and away from this god-awful place. I managed to get home just after 10 p.m., more than a little tired. 10 hours driving and almost 7 hours hiking. Sadly, I have done stupider things and I would yet do worse. So having seen the spots and soaking up the ambience, I began dwelling on the problem, trying to come up with a scenario that reasonably fit what was known about the case and as a bonus, might just make some sense. On October 29, only 2 days after my hike, I was at home looking at an overall map of Death Valley. Like viewing one of those optical illusions where an image suddenly pops out, everything just fell into place and became visible. I suddenly saw a way the Germans could have ended up in Anvil Canyon through a series of reasonable, honest mistakes, and why they might have set out for the south. I was also acutely aware that I might have done exactly the same thing were I in their situation. Is this, in fact, what happened? No one can know for sure. But it offered an explanation for their apparent actions and fits the known facts of the incident very well. The next section is a slightly edited down version of an email I sent out to several interested parties on October 29. I believe there are sometimes situations in which individuals can end up finding themselves in great peril without making grossly bad decisions. Fortunately, it doesn't happen often, but I think it does happen. In the case of the Germans, it involves a series of honest mistakes that I myself could have made and ended up in a similar situation. But there is one piece of information that I, and many reading this would have, that Egbert didn't. And that piece of information probably would have changed the outcome. There are some who will say that any backcountry travel in Death Valley using a normal street vehicle in summer is inherently foolish. This is certainly a debatable topic. But it is well known that summer in Death Valley does have a strong attraction for many European visitors, especially Germans, and every year many backcountry visits happen without incident. So for purposes of this discussion I will set aside the overall reasonableness of summer travel in Death Valley and focus on specific actions. Going into this, there are a couple of big picture parameters that should be kept in mind. First, their rental van was due back in Los Angeles on July 26, and they were returning to Germany the next day, the 27th. Second, they may have been low on funds. The official reports indicate Egbert had some trouble getting money transferred to him earlier in the trip, i.e., San Clemente. He later requested additional money from his ex-wife, sent to him in Las Vegas. This didn't occur, so money was perhaps an issue as they planned to travel to Yosemite via Death Valley. Arriving at the visitor center on the 22nd, they may have been looking for a route to see interesting Death Valley things, with the ultimate goal being Yosemite. But why would they head down West Side Road and not see the major DV attractions? The Germans obviously knew that with valley floor temperatures reaching 124°F they couldn't camp in the main valley, and low funds would have precluded renting a room at Furnace Creek. But the hot weather camping could be tolerable if they headed up a side canyon to make camp up and away from the valley floor where camping is not permitted. Perhaps they made inquiries about camping at the visitor center on the 22nd. Camping up a side canyon is supported by Emmett Harder's comment that he recognized in their developed photo roll a sunset view taken in Hanaupa Canyon. There's also water in the upper reaches of Hanaupa. Note that there aren't any camping opportunities on the east side of the valley, but several on the west. This could explain their choice of the West Side Road. The maps they had available to them showed a route to the west, via Butte Valley and Mengle Pass, past the infamous Barker Ranch, Charles Manson's old hangout, then north to the ghost town of Ballarat and on to Yosemite. Possibly an entertaining route for the Germans if they knew the history of those locales. Their lack of familiarity with desert road conditions was obvious in the overall plan, but understandable. They had no real appreciation for how rugged routes like these could actually be, but there was probably some reasonable wariness on their part. But at a planning level, it made sense. So at this point, we have the Germans up Hanaupa Canyon on the night of July 22nd. They would have successfully navigated a considerable number of dirt road miles on West Side Road, which may have lowered their guard as to potential hazards. They also made it up Hanaupa Canyon in their vehicle, no small achievement, which may have further bolstered their confidence as to backcountry traveling. And they had 3 nights left before they had to be back in Los Angeles. Just enough time for a quick trip through Yosemite, which they may have expected to reach by the next night, the 23rd. So probably early on the morning of the 23rd, to beat the heat, they left Hanaupa Canyon and continued south to Warm Spring Road and turned west. They would have experienced a very fine dirt road at that point, validating their overall plan. Reaching the Warm Spring camp, they probably stopped because they thought it was an active settlement of some sort, which is what it appears from the road, and to make inquiries as to road conditions further west, a reasonable course of action. Instead, they found the Warm Spring camp deserted, and actually part of DVNP, so they signed the register, indicating they were going over the pass. This would have meant Mengel Pass. It also suggests a certain amount of caution and foresight, leaving a record should anything happen. Again, reasonable actions. Continuing westerly toward Butte Valley, they encountered their first sections of truly questionable 2WD road. These segments would have been quite challenging, but aren't too lengthy. If Egbert was skillful enough to traverse them, and had taken out the collision damage waiver on the van, he might have been put back at ease when reaching the relatively benign portions of road inside of Butte Valley. But by now they would have invested considerable time getting in there, thus the pressure to continue westward would have mounted. Coming upon the stone cabin, it again would have looked like someone's home. It would be reasonable for them to stop and make another attempt to inquire about road conditions, but when doing so, found it empty and the cabin part of the park system. So on they continued, purloined flag in the van. As they approached Mengel Pass, it would have become apparent their vehicle was incapable of continuing. There was probably some foot scouting of the route, but it was obvious they had to turn back. Now there was a problem. At this point it was probably late afternoon. Via Warm Spring Road it would have taken at least 2 hours for them to return to the paved road in the valley, and it was going opposite the direction they needed to go. The clock was working against them if they wanted to see Yosemite and be in LA on the 26th. Plus they already knew how bad portions of the road were between Butte Valley and Warm Spring and could not have not been looking forward to traveling over those segments again. However, their pamphlet offered an erroneous, alternative, apparently shorter route back down to the valley in the form of a road down Anvil Canyon. Although one should always be wary of the devil you know versus the devil you don't, it may have seemed a reasonable gamble. After all, they could always turn around if it got too bad and use Warm Spring Road instead, couldn't they? So now it's late afternoon on the 23rd, and the Germans return to the intersection at the stone cabin and turn right onto Anvil Canyon Road. This intersection is so obvious it's highly improbable they got confused and accidentally turned down Anvil Canyon. Striped Butte is both a massive landmark and guidepost, showing the way in and out of Butte Valley. The turn onto Anvil Canyon Road was likely premeditated and reasoned. And the first 1/2 miles until the mouth of the canyon are quite fine, validating their choice and perhaps lowering their guard. And even the portions after passing into the mouth of Anvil Canyon are reasonable, for a while. But then Egbert would have quickly discovered he was driving more in a wash than on a road. And if you're used to driving a rear-wheel drive vehicle, although the van was front-wheel drive, and you come upon a sandy area, what do? You keep up your speed at all costs, i.e., you drive like hell. The need to keep moving at a fast speed, plus the desire to get back to the main canyon ASAP likely contributed to driving much too fast for conditions, especially given their low-slung vehicle. It was only a matter of time until rocks started taking out the rear tires. But given the front-wheel drive aspect of the van, they may have been slowed but could still keep moving forward. Most people who have been in that uncomfortable situation know that if you stop, it's difficult or impossible to get started again. So whatever you do, don't stop. After over 2 miles of successful but no doubt frightening travel, the Germans misjudged a road fork and went right when the road in fact veered left, thus sealing their fate. This put them in a right-side tributary of the Wash. It appears they realized this, and tried to cut back left to join the main road, or what passed for it, and got stuck in the sandy, gravelly area in between. Given the nature of the wash, use of a compact spare would not have provided them with much benefit, what with 2 other flat tires. At this point they entered into a survival situation, but may not have fully appreciated that fact. The temperature, which peaked that day on the valley floor at 124 degrees, was maybe 104 at their elevation, at this late time in the day. Hot, but not necessarily lethal. Their main concern might have been suddenly realizing they needed to have their van back in LA in just a few more days and meet their flight. They clearly needed to find someone to help them extract their vehicle. The site evidence suggests someone, probably Egbert, traveled 1.7 miles easterly down Anvil Canyon and drank a beer under a bush while sitting on the ground. The size of the butt prints suggest it was a large person, and thus Egbert. The location of the bottle and prints, on the easterly side of the bush, suggest it was providing shade during the very late afternoon. From this location is possible to see easterly down canyon to the mouth of Anvil Canyon, about 8 miles, and all the way to the east side of the main valley where the paved Badwater Road is, about 16 miles. It also is a good spot to formulate a plan of action. The Germans were stranded in a spot in which they needed the help of others to extricate their vehicle and thus be able to make their flight back home. Given the information available to them, where could they best find it? It is likely they had gone the entire day without seeing another human, so their entry route offered little hope of others. In examining their maps, Ballarat was many miles away, and with unknown services. Furnace Creek, with everything they needed, was far to the north, out of their reach. Even the paved Badwater Road on the valley's east side had only intermittent traffic and was in a zone of lethal heat. But there was another possibility. Remember that the Germans were new to the desert southwest and unfamiliar with things that to some of us are so obvious we don't even realize we take them for granted. The Germans had likely seen many military installations in Europe, and they had certain commonalities. They all had fences which were regularly patrolled by armed personnel. From Egbert's perspective and knowledge pool, the likelihood of patrols or sentries at the edge of a military installation would have seemed quite high. Egbert, looking at the maps available to him, would have seen the northern boundary of the China Lake Naval Weapons Center, NWC, to be only about 8 or 9 miles to the south of them. This was about the same distance he could see from his resting spot to the mouth of Anvil Canyon, which does not appear that distant, and only half of that to Badwater Road. Also from the same resting spot, looking to the south shows what appears to be a simple traversable route south, up over a low pass in the mountains. It would be easy to imagine cresting the hills he was looking at to the south and seeing the safety of a military installation just a few miles further. Plus, instead of descending down into lethal heat, they would have been able to stay high at lesser temperatures. It would seem a clever and reasonable idea. Of course, we who have seen U.S. desert military installations know that there are seldom fences, and few, if any, patrols. Security is provided more by vastness rather than fencing. But someone from Germany would not know that. That is what we know that Egbert didn't. After formulating his plan at the Bottle Bush, Egbert headed back to the van. The group then probably spent the night at the van. A stay of some duration was evidenced by the presence of the fecal material in dug holes, and then early the next morning locked the vehicle and headed east down Anvil Canyon to a little past the Bottle Bush, then turned south toward the China Lake NWC boundary in hope of rescue. Having been at the stone cabin, they would have seen Anvil Spring and known of the presence of water and shelter only 4 miles behind them. But they chose not to avail themselves of this, because they didn't feel they were in a survival situation, felt time pressure due to their travel plans and were confident enough they would come across soldiers who could help them with their predicament. The stone cabin, while offering water and shelter, offered no immediate means of extrication for them, and they could miss their flight. There is a rather famous saying from Sherlock Holmes. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. In other words, at this point, given the amount of expert searching already performed, the probability of the Germans being found in Anvil Canyon, between Anvil Canyon and Warm Spring or in the main valley was very low. The inescapable conclusion therefore is that they must be somewhere that hasn't been yet searched. And that would be south. What route or routes might they have used? The topography constrains such that there are really only 3 north-south drainages easterly of Squaw Spring of varying degrees of obviousness. As one travels east down Anvil Canyon, the most pronounced route is almost opposite the Bottle Bush. That's not to say they couldn't have headed south directly from the van, but the range of mountains immediately south do appear intimidating. Besides, Egbert would have already seen the apparent pass beyond Squaw Spring. About 2 miles southerly of Squaw Spring, one reaches the edge of a high valley. Actually, it appears to be more a combination of alluvial fans. This valley is a rectangle about 1.5 miles NS and about 2 miles EW. On the southerly edge there's a rim of hills before it drops down into a vast vista across the Wingate Wash area and into China Lake NWC, where there is little to be seen. This range of hills provides the first clear view of what lies ahead. Upon reaching this upper alluvial fan area, and not immediately seeing a military facility, the party may have started to realize their error, that it was indeed a survival situation, and paused. Egbert may have left Connie and the kids at some sheltered locale and proceeded onward in search of help, never to return. This scenario suggests reconsideration of the sleeping bag found near the AT&T relay tower and the German canteens allegedly found between Needle Peak and Sugarloaf. So in summary, this incident could have been the result of a series of honest mistakes or minor lapses in judgment. Further, Egbert was a smart guy and the prospect of salvation via a military facility could well have occurred to him, drawing them all into a no-win situation. We knew where they were not. They must be somewhere that hasn't been searched. Up until now, there hasn't been shown any compelling reason why they would turn south. It looked like it was time to have a closer look in that direction. At this point I was rather excited. I finally had a theory for what happened that appeared to explain all the known facts. I wrote it up and quickly sent it out to those people I had been corresponding with on this project. I generally received back supportive, if wary feedback. Seems like everybody's gotta have a scenario. It probably didn't matter either way, because now I was on a roll. I set about studying this southerly alluvial fan intently and looking for some way to explore it. As mentioned, the area was about 1.5 miles by 2 miles in size. The topo maps showed 3 canyons running southerly from Anvil Canyon up to this area. I arbitrarily labeled them N1, N2 and N3 on the map shown, with the easterlymost canyon being the largest and easiest to traverse. The westerlymost canyon passed near Squaw Spring. For anyone desiring to continue south beyond this upper area, there were only 3 feasible routes, labeled S1 through S3 on the attached map. 2 of them consisted of washes, a large one at the southeast corner and a smaller one at the southwest corner. In between these there was a saddle in the hills that joined into a middle wash running southward. Once south of this upper area, it was only a few miles to the boundary of the China Lake military property and not an extreme distance to the AT&T relay tower. As I was wrestling with this problem, I managed to track down the email address of the individual who allegedly found the German canteens. Having studied the maps, it was fairly obvious to me how he could have easily ridden a motorcycle through that area. I was anxious to contact him and see if he could provide any details about the area or what he saw. I sent out a very delicately worded query considering what he did was illegal, explaining what I was up to, but unfortunately never got a response until it didn't matter anymore. It was clear that exploring the upper alluvial fan was going to be a problem due to lack of water. The only reliable source of water in the field was Squaw Spring, and that was 2 miles north of the area. Charlie Callaghan of DVNP had suggested Squaw Spring as a possible source of water to carry up to the upper area and cache for expeditions. The pace of my planning was accelerating. On October 31st I sent out an email to a number of individuals proposing an expedition in the near future to this upper alluvial fan by way of Squaw Spring. The idea was to take on water at the spring and carry it up to the search area, making camp for 2 nights. The water would allow for 1 full day's searching, then return out via Anvil Canyon on day 3. Unfortunately, most were busy, or it sounded too stupid for them, and I received minimal response. But at this point I wasn't about to let it go, so I convinced one of my RMRU teammates, Leigh Walker, to come along. So early on the morning of November 11, 2009, I picked up Leigh in Riverside and we blasted out to the wilds of Death Valley. This outing was to be a bit more participatory than some. In addition to the usual PLB I carry, Leigh was bringing along a spot satellite tracker. He set it up to periodically report our location to overhead satellites, which would relay the points to a web page showing Google Maps. People whom we invited, family members, RMRU team members, etc., would be able to observe our location in near real time on that web page as the trip progressed. We also took the precaution of notifying staff at DVNP as well as Debbie of CLMRG of our plans in case something went weird. Not that that ever happens. After passing through the gloriousness that is Baker yet again, and feasting on mini-mart goodness, Leigh and I made it to the trailhead and started down Anvil Canyon about 11:30 a.m. on a wonderfully cool and sunny day. Leigh wanted to see both the van and bottle location, both of which we reached surprisingly quickly. From the bottle bush we turned south and headed almost straight for Squaw Spring. This turned out to be a pretty hard climb, or maybe it was that our packs were full. Either way it sucked, but it was about to suck even more. We reached Squaw Spring around 2 p.m. and proceeded to search for any open water with which we could top off our tanks. This was somewhat of an abort situation for us. If we were unable to find extra water at Squaw Spring, we had just enough with us to proceed to our planned campsite high on a corner of the upper alluvial fan, spend the night and return out immediately the next morning. So water, at this point, was rather important if we were to do any real searching. Unfortunately, that was proving to be a bit difficult. We spent about 30 minutes searching through the green clump of trees and brush on the hillside to no avail. Lots of growth, but no open water from which we could pump from. Our concern level started to rise. Next we checked one of the adjacent ravines with lush green growth. Again, no water. Finally, a short distance from our original target, we found a ravine thick with reeds, which contained a small but nice pool of water. Leigh whipped out his filter and began pumping into a 2.5-gallon collapsible container I had brought. The container Leigh was filling was one of those ideas I get that I perhaps should have thought through a bit more. It had a handle on it, and I guess I just figured I'd carry the damn thing as we hiked along. But by now the terrain was rugged enough that with a full pack on I really needed to use both my hiking poles as stabilizers. That was going to make carrying 20 pounds of water, also known as 2.5 gallons, very difficult. I found I still had barely enough room in my pack to stuff the container in, which I did, and was able to offload some of my other heavy items to lay. This still left me with a pack in the 65-pound range, and 2 miles of off-trail climbing to go. Our planned route was a canyon just a bit east from Squaw Spring which we planned to take south all the way to its very head. This would put us at the northwest corner of the area we were interested in searching. The segment from Squaw Spring east to the canyon was very annoying, as it required us to traverse multiple ravines along the way. The extra weight just made it all the more special. The route up the canyon, while steep, was amazingly scenic, with fantastic cliffs along the west side. Finally, at 4:45 p.m. as darkness was falling we crested the head of the canyon and reached our planned campsite. This was the first view of our planned search area, and my first thought was, this will take at least several trips to cover, which wasn't exactly appealing now that I fully appreciated just how nasty it was to get here. The campsite was very exposed and the wind was picking up, making things difficult. We spent more time than we should setting up the tents and getting settled in and didn't finish until it was very dark. Given the cold and windy conditions and not being able to have a fire, we each retreated into our sleeping bags and tents early for what passes as backcountry camping in the new millennium. Leigh spent a few hours listening to an MP3 book, while I killed time watching movies on my iPhone. Ain't technology grand? We were both up early the next morning, eager to get started. The weather had improved somewhat and the winds had died. We dropped most of our gear at our camp, and blissfully switched to day packs for the day. We thought we might return to our camp for lunch, and planned to split the day into 2 search areas. We set off from our camp around 7 a.m. and headed due south along the westerly edge of our search area. Our general plan was to search the perimeter of the rectangular search area, paying special attention to the southerly edge. As we moved south, we traveled a few hundred yards apart to maximize our search coverage. We kept in contact by radio or just yelled. As we moved south, the remaining clouds cleared and we were rewarded with an amazing view of the east slopes of Needle Peak. We also realized that very few people had ever seen what we were seeing, as remote as the area was. Shortly before 8 a.m. we reached the southwesterly corner of our search area. This was a wash that continued southerly, Route S1, and was one of the 3 routes out of the search area for someone heading south. It looked to be a wide and an easy route, but we saw no signs of human passage. So we turned left and began moving easterly along the southerly edge of our search area. As we continued on, I noticed the saddle in the hills ahead. It was the second of the 3 possible routes south, S2, and was worth a look. So I moved up along the south hills while Leigh followed the wash easterly along the base of the hills. At 8:43 a.m., when I had reached a point 100 feet from the saddle, the radio crackled. It was Leigh, saying he had found a wine bottle. A wine bottle? Now that was odd. I heard Leigh mention something about it having a label, and my hopes dropped a bit, as I'd expect any label to be long gone after 13 years. Then he corrected it to say, no, there were only a few label fragments on the bottle. At this point I knew that we probably had enough with that one bottle to get other search teams out in the area. But I still needed to check the saddle and continued up with lessened enthusiasm since Leigh was below and finding interesting things. Again, the radio went off. Leigh was reporting seeing what looked like toilet paper in the bushes. Huh? Toilet paper lasts only a short time in this sort of environment. Closer inspection by Leigh showed it to actually be pages from a daily planner, with printing in German. At this point it was clear Leigh had found something very significant down below, but I needed to finish searching the saddle before joining him. By now I had reached the saddle and was struck by the sweeping vista to the south. While the route below me, heading off to the south, looked like a very easy path, there was nothing to be seen off in the distance. Just vast, empty spaces. I was interrupted by the radio again. Tom, we have some bones here. It was time to rejoin Leigh. Before I left the saddle, I took the time to do a panoramic shot, looking northerly, which encompassed the entire alluvial fan. It's shown below. That's Needle Peak on the left side and Sugarloaf on the right. The darker hills in the distance are the northerly slopes of Anvil Canyon. The site, where Leigh was at the moment, is identified. Les's spot was about 600 meters away from me to the northeast, and I hurried to descend. By the time I arrived, I found Leigh at the base of vertical, north-facing 30 cliff at the north end of a small hill. It was 9:14 a.m. I was standing on the top of the hill, looking down on the scene. I could see a number of white items, which were clearly skeletal remains, scattered over a wide area. As I was headed down from the saddle, Lay had found a wallet full of ID cards. They all said Cornelia Meyer. We spent the next hour carefully examining the site. The debris was scattered over perhaps 150 meters, but seemed to radiate out from the cliff face. There was a small but active wash near the base of the cliff, which Lay had been following, which seemed to disperse some items slightly downstream. We observed multiple items we believed associated with Cornelia, due to their proximity with her ID, including her passport and bank ID with photo. Lay found a toothbrush and a tube of some sort of salve or toothpaste. In a small side wash to the northwest, we found remains of a small shoe that could have been a woman's shoe or that of a child. We found portions of Cornelia's daily planner, with numerous business cards from places the Germans had stayed on their trip. In addition to the 2-liter wine bottle, we found a clear bottle about 70 downstream. This was later identified as one of the Bud Ice bottles from the van, but the more time we spent exploring, the more perplexed we got. We are anything but anatomy experts, but it seemed as if we were seeing the remains of only one person, Cornelia. And all the other items also seemed to point to Cornelia. Where were Egbert and the kids? Apparently our mystery wasn't over yet. But we were impressed with one amazing fact: to reach this spot required them to have hiked 8 or 9 miles over rough terrain, in street shoes, in July. In my mind they had earned a lot of respect for this accomplishment. This was a tough group. As we took an overall look at the location, we noted the connection between the saddle and the cliff face. They were in direct line of sight of each other. Also, the cliff area was one of the very few shady areas to be found for quite a distance. Was Cornelia waiting at the base of the cliff, alone but for a couple of water bottles, for Egbert and the kids to return from somewhere south of the saddle? As far as the Germans knew, the China Lake military boundary, and their hope for salvation, was only 4 miles to the south. Did Egbert take the kids and head south, never to return? We couldn't tell, but we knew we had enough to finally crack a 13-year-old mystery. Now all we had to do was get the information out. We decided what we found was of enough magnitude to cut short our search plans and report into DVNP headquarters at Furnace Creek as soon as we could. It was also a great excuse not to have to spend another night out. At this point it was just after 10 a.m., and we knew that if we hustled we could get all the way out into Furnace Creek before things closed at 5 p.m. We figured we were just under 2 miles from our camp, then another 9 miles to get back out to the truck. What with the hiking we had already done that morning, it was shaping up to be a long day. Before we departed, Lay and I decided to bring back some of Cornelia's ID as proof that we weren't just morons jumping to conclusions. We were aware of the evidentiary nature of the stuff, but it had been sitting in a wash for 13 years, so we weren't likely to mess up anything. We chose items we wouldn't damage in transit, and we certainly didn't disturb any of the skeletal remains. So we carefully packed up the wallet with the ID cards and started off. We reached camp in about an hour, rested a bit, then packed up and headed down canyon. It was especially painful to dump all that extra water we now didn't need, but we lightened our loads to the minimum. We wondered what the people back at home who were following our progress via the spot tracker were thinking. They had seen a casual hike in the morning, then an intense and long period in one location, then a straight line back to camp and heading out early. They must know something is up. After a long and dreary slog, but moving as fast as we could, we reached the truck at about 2:20 p.m. We knew that we had a good 1/2 hours before we would reach the pavement of Badwater Road, then maybe an hour before we could reach Furnace Creek. At that pace the park offices would be closed and reporting in would be more difficult. But we had a trick up our sleeves we'd hoped to play. Generally, there is no cell phone coverage in Death Valley. Note, this was before the cell tower was installed at Furnace Creek. In some high spots, with the right provider, maybe. But you're pretty much out of luck. On our way into Butte Valley, Lay still had his iPhone on and noticed there was a spot along Warm Spring Road, between West Side Road and the mouth of Warm Spring Canyon, where he suddenly got 3 bars of signal. It was a very small area, maybe 3/4 mile long, and probably was connecting to a cell tower far to the south at Dumont Dunes. But we knew it provided us the opportunity to make some calls. Sure enough, just after 4 p.m. as we approached the spot our phones lit up with routine, incoming email. I quickly sent off a short email to Debbie that we had found what appeared to be Cornelia, along with ID, and were headed toward Furnace Creek to report in. I also called Charlie Callaghan of DVNP, who had been one of the original searchers and had been helpful to us. Unfortunately it went to voicemail, so I hoped he would get it by the time we got to Furnace Creek. After Lay finished his calls, we blasted off into radio silence again and turned north at high speed. The less said about our speed as we drove toward Furnace Creek the better. I'm not certain what the statute of limitation on speeding in a national park is. Suffice to say, we screeched into the visitor center parking lot at 5:02 p.m., 2 minutes after closing. Lay had put on an RMRU t-shirt and I had put on an RMRU cap in an attempt to show we weren't just your average wankers coming out of the desert, even though, in fact, we were. As we came up to the locked door, we saw there was still a ranger putting some stuff away behind the counter. We knocked on the door and motioned to her in a manner that was meant to convey both urgency and coolness, as there were some tourists outside sitting next to us, looking at maps. As the ranger came toward the door, I was trying to figure out how to whisper to her through the glass that we had found human remains in the backcountry and needed to speak with an adult-type person. But she suddenly saw our RMRU logos and said, "Oh, you're the rescue guys. They're waiting for you out back." Let the commotion begin. We were brought back into the DVNP offices behind the visitor center where a couple of the staff and the chief ranger waited for us. As soon as he saw the bag we had with Cornelia's ID, he got a bit upset and rather sternly told us we shouldn't have done that. But being RMRU members, Lay and I are used to being in various forms of trouble and are good at smiling dumbly and offering up a quizzical, "Huh?" But after we flashed our Riverside County RMRU cards and the ranger remembered working with RMRU when he was at Joshua Tree years ago, good memories, surprisingly, things calmed down and it warmed a bit. And when the park's law enforcement folks arrived, they seemed thrilled to have the ID materials as it gave them a somewhat positive, if tentative, ID. They spent about a half hour photographing the items in detail. As Lay and I were assigned to writing out individual narratives of what happened, who writes anything in longhand these days? More staff streamed in saying they had heard one of the Germans had been found. We could hear outgoing phone calls being made. At one point I heard someone say on the phone describing Lay and I, "Yeah, these guys are enthusiasts." I dug my pen a bit deeper into the paper after hearing that oh-so-complimentary moniker. With all the comings and goings, it was hard to tell who was who and what they did. Eventually Lay and I were put on the phone with an Inyo County Sheriff's Office investigator and answered some of his questions. He asked if we would be willing to stay over until morning when he could arrive and more thoroughly interview us at 8 a.m. As much as we would have liked to have left for home, we reluctantly agreed. Adding a bit of injury to that situation was while DVNP was more than willing to offer us a free campsite if we wanted to camp overnight, if we wanted a real room at Furnace Creek Ranch, well, that was our problem and our cost. I suppose we could have just snuck off. It was now about 7 p.m. and we had been without food other than energy bars for most of the day in an effort to get in ASAP, had hiked 14 miles that day and were dirty and crusted with sweat and sunscreen. My credit card came flying out pretty quickly. Once we had secured a room, Lay and I dragged our tired butts over to the cafe and finally had a decent meal. Both Lay and I were up early the next morning and showed up at Park HQ well before 8 a.m. One of the rangers came out and said we were wanted at the airstrip, about a half-mile away. Waiting there, we saw some Inyo SAR members, officers from the Inyo County Sheriff's Office and a Seahawks helicopter. They needed one of us to accompany them back to the site in the helicopter and show them what we found. Lay generously suggested I accompany them, and he'd stay back and speak with the sheriff's staff. Getting into the Seahawks, I was put in a single, rear-facing seat behind the pilots. There were another 3 people facing me, who I didn't quite know but assumed they were with the Inyo Sheriff's Office. Rounding out the crew were a couple of flight officers, resting comfortably on the floor with their harnesses clipped into the cabin. After being given a helmet, goggles and ear protection, we lifted off and began the 40-mile flight south. I knew the pilots had been given the GPS coordinates of the site, so I sat back to enjoy the flight, straining to turn around and follow our route. Despite my awkward seat, I was able to keep good track of where we were, passing Telescope Peak and over Hanaupa Canyon. Finally, I could see the massive striped butte in Butte Valley and knew we were just about there. Oddly though, we were now moving away from Anvil Canyon and the site. I got the attention of one of the flight officers and began shaking my head, and pointing off in a different direction from our course. In the din of the Seahawks, it was next to impossible to communicate without a headset, and I didn't have one. As the helicopter slowly turned, the flight officer pulled off one of my hearing protectors and yelled that there had been a bust in the GPS coordinates, and that what the pilots had been given was obviously miles from the site. But through a happy random happenstance, I had my GPS unit in my parka pocket. I quickly pulled it out, turned it on and locked in onto the waypoint I had saved for the site. Unfortunately, the metal shell of the fuselage was shielding the GPS signal and it couldn't acquire the satellites. At this point the second flight officer realized what was up, moved over to me and motioned to release my seat harness. He then placed a waist harness around me which was tethered to the ceiling. I wasn't sure exactly what was happening, but it was starting to get very interesting. They next slid open the right cabin door and waved me over to the edge. "Okay, sure, Fine, whatever. I handed the GPS unit, which was now acquiring a lock, to the flight officer and looked out the door. I could see Squaw Spring on the mountainside adjacent to us, and I knew we were now headed generally in the right direction. I leaned further out, emboldened by the harness and the death grip I had on the door handle, and pointed out the course. I could see from my GPS in the hand of the flight officer that we were just over 3 miles from the site, and I could easily make out the bluff in the distance. As we continued on, I kept a continual point on the location and could see the flight officer counting down the distance to the pilots and giving them course corrections. As we finally swung over the site, I kept my arm pointed at it as the others in the helicopter leaned forward to have a look. Even though we were still at least 100 feet up, it was possible to see some scattered skeletal remains, and I could see the excitement of the other passengers. We set down several hundred meters from the site so as to not disturb it with the rotor blast, and the passengers piled out. Having come from sea level at Furnace Creek to almost 4,000, it was surprisingly cold, and I was glad to have brought my parka shell. As the Seahawks departed to the north to bring back another group, I pointed out the major areas Lay and I had found, then hung back to let the professionals do their thing. I ended up walking with one very pleasant individual who didn't seem overly familiar with the case and was asking a lot of questions. Curious, I finally asked what agency he was with. "The FBI," he replied. Oh great, I thought, as I did a rapid mental rewind of all that I had said to him as we had been walking, hoping for nothing dumb. Turned out it was fairly routine, as it was a case involving foreign nationals within a national park, so the FBI wanted a cursory look at it. The bonus to this was the reason we had the air support was to get the FBI agent into the site. Soon I heard the helicopter returning with more law enforcement and SAR personnel. I asked if I was needed any more, and was told I could go, so I was the only passenger on the return back to Furnace Creek. As we sat down, I could see Lay talking with an Inyo sheriff's officer. Lay had been filling him in on all we had done, as well as how we had figured it out. The investigator did ask Lay where he was in July of 1996. Apparently he just looked suspicious. Whatever Lay told him must have satisfied him, as I was really only asked for my contact info and that was it. It was now the late morning of Friday, November 13th, and we were finally cleared to leave. The Inyo Sheriff's Office did request we minimize our contact with the press, as until the remains and other evidence could be removed from the site, they would be in jeopardy if the location were known. By the time we reached Barstow, the news of our find was out on the wires. Upon reaching home at last, I sent out a few emails to some of the folks who had helped with the effort, filling in the details of what some of them had already heard. Unfortunately, I was a bit naive in my trust of certain individuals, and some sensitive data eventually got leaked onto the internet. Especially appalling to me was an image of Cornelia's bank card, with her picture, which I emailed to someone I trusted. Without my knowledge or approval, he not only forwarded it on to others, he published it in a subscription newsletter. I found this breach of ethics and display of insensitivity to the victims' families just stunning. Fortunately, it actually wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it made me pretty angry. There was a lot of press interest, but Inyo wasn't giving out our identification, so we had some shelter. I've already had my 15 minutes of fame in life, so I was quite enjoying keeping a low profile and avoiding the press. Beyond that, Lay and I were asked not to reveal any details of the location, as everything was still out there and unprotected. Given the interest that was building, it was proving a challenge. After a couple days of recovery, I started pondering what we had seen. Did we really find only Cornelia? If so, where were the others? The fact that we found 2 fluid containers with her made me think she was left there. If she had been on her own, or pushing forward, she would have dropped the empty containers as she moved. Factor in the available shade and the site's view of the saddle, and it suggested to me she was waiting for someone to return, someone who had continued south over the saddle. But once over the saddle, where would they have gone? I knew that there was no military base visible in the valley to the south. There were only 2 possible man-made structures present for many miles, the old AT&T microwave relay tower and the Wingate airfield, a strafing target area consisting of junked aircraft on a scraped dirt, mock airstrip inside the China Lake NWC military boundaries. It seemed to make sense that if some of the group continued south, they would likely head for one of those objects. The AT&T tower was especially intriguing, about 11 miles southerly from the site of the remains. Could Egbert possibly have made it that far and dropped the missing sleeping bag in the road? Pretty quickly there was word of an impending large evidence search to which RMRU would be invited. Somehow I ended up being the contact person, and on November 11th, I got a call from Corporal Terry Waterbury of the Inyo County Sheriff's Office, who identified himself as the search manager for the upcoming effort. He began filling me in on the plan, which left me more than a little surprised. The idea was to assemble upwards of 30 people in Butte Valley in just over a week and a half to do the search. I asked about air support and he told me he was at the mercy of the CHP, as they would provide a helicopter if available. If available? I further was informed that the helicopter was primarily for the insertion of cadaver dogs, as the corporal seemed to be entertaining the idea the area was a potential homicide scene. I asked if the dogs were going to be flown out and was told no, they would have to hike out. I think I spent more than a little time trying to make it clear to Corporal Waterbury, who had never been in Anvil Canyon, just what sort of terrain the dogs would be facing. Somewhere along the way, he mentioned that each team might be responsible for carrying in their own water supplies. This was a nuttier plan than what Lay and I had just pulled off, and ours was fairly wacky. I'm afraid what I viewed as rising concern on my part due to my knowledge of the area was interpreted by Corporal Waterbury as general obnoxiousness on my part, and he grew more than a little testy. Really, I'm only rude to people I know well. But the final stunning bit came at the very end of our conversation. When Lay and I took Connie's day planner back to the DVNP HQ at Furnace Creek, we saw a pronounced folded piece of pink paper stuck in it. We thought it could be a note, but didn't want to risk any damage by trying to open it, so we let it be. But I was very interested in what it could be. As Corporal Waterbury seemed very familiar with the items recovered to date, I thought I'd slip it in as a final question. His rather gruff response, "I don't know anything about that, and if there was a note, it would be in German and we don't have anyone who speaks German, I'm not exaggerating, that's precisely what he said to me." I now knew what sort of organization I was dealing with. For reasons I still don't fully understand, the search plan for November 20th to 23rd imploded and was postponed to December 4th to 6th. I never heard from Corporal Waterbury again, but instead got a call from Deputy Tim Winkler of the Inyo Sheriff's Office, who seemed to have taken over the planning. Or at least was the guy at Inyo Sheriff's assigned to deal with me. In any event, the plans for the search had changed more than a little, and Winkler actually seemed interested in my comments, seeing as I had actually been there. Winkler was struggling with the logistics of such a search, given the remoteness of the area, it being within both a national park and a wilderness area, whose managers seriously frowned on helicopter operations in the absence of immediate human welfare issues, and the difficulty of justifying the expense of helicopters without lives being in immediate jeopardy, i.e., no helicopters for bones. The latter point is not unreasonable for a cash-strapped county such as Inyo, but helicopters were really the only way to reasonably get searchers into the area. I had a couple of telephone conversations with Winkler and knew that he was also interested in the area southerly of where the remains had been found, so any searching would likely include some of that area. However, I had concerns, as the China Lake military boundary, only 4 miles or so southerly of the remains, seemed like an impenetrable wall to civilian searchers and was off-limits. Add to that I was not nearly as familiar with that area as I would like. Can you say, road trip? On November 21st, since the big search had been postponed, Jerry and I decided to do a day hike to the AT&T relay tower to check out its visibility. I wanted to see if someone heading south from where the remains were found could see the tower and perhaps be attracted to it. We also wanted to hike to the Epsom Salt Works, which while still in DVNP, would give a good view to the north, across the China Lake property, to the south slopes of the area of the remains. It's a long, remote drive into the relay tower, about 41 miles from leaving the pavement. We found the facility in worse shape than our previous visit in 1996. I noticed from a sign on the fence that the facility is no longer owned by AT&T but rather American Tower. This time the gate was open and vandals had been taking their toll on the building, and all the antenna feed lines to the horn antennas had been removed. On the plus side, this meant it was safe to go up the actual tower and check the sight lines. I was very surprised to find there weren't any sight lines at all to the north. The tower was situated to provide some sort of east-west linkage, and the mountain range it was on blocked the view completely from the north. In order to catch a glimpse of the tower, someone would have to be far to the west at the Wingate airfield to first see it. Further, there were no anti-collision lights on the tower, and didn't appear like there were any in 1996 either. It appeared impossible the tower could have been any sort of attraction to someone from the north. Leaving the tower, we drove a couple miles back down the road to the trailhead for the Epsom Salt Works and started hiking in from there. The Salt Works was an operation from the 1920s that connected to Trona via a monorail system. As is usual for these sort of things, it never made much money and shut down after only a few years. It is part of DVNP and juts into the China Lake property for a couple of miles. There are no formal trails to it, but it's easy cross-country travel as long as you heed the signs and don't cross onto the China Lake property. At this point we were only 10 miles south of the remains and the entire southerly expanse from the remains was clearly visible. I took a lot of pictures and we called it a day. As we returned to our vehicle, we hiked past the very spot where in August of 2009 a mother and son were trapped when they got lost in their 4WD, ending up driving off-road and their vehicle stuck in a collapsed animal burrow. They were found after 5 days, but not before the 6-year-old son succumbed to the heat. It was not lost on me how close this was to where the Germans perished, and how unforgiving an area it is. The image below shows the view south, back toward the area Connie was found. The spot labeled West Wash is S1, the spot labeled Saddle is S2, a point I had reached prior, and the spot labeled East Wash is S3. If Egbert continued south, this is the area he would have had to cross. Eventually the matter became moot. Around this time I heard again from Deputy Winkler. He had been doing a bit of investigation into the sleeping bag found on the AT&T Tower Road and turned up some new information. In speaking with the original investigator on the case, Winkler was able to roughly place a date as to when the bag was found. It appeared the bag was found and retrieved in the month of September, 1996. The road it was found on was typically patrolled by rangers at least once a week during that period. Had it been left by one of the Germans, it would have appeared there by the end of July, and thus would have been noticed during August patrols. Given this situation, and the lack of visibility of the AT&T Tower to anyone from the north, it appeared unlikely the two incidents could be connected and the mysterious sleeping bag could be dismissed as a clue. On the morning of Friday, December 4th, an 8-person team of RMRU members left Hemet for Ballarat to join in a joint search effort for evidence of the Germans. Well, in truth it wasn't quite that simple, because as we were in the process of departing Hemet we were called to perform a rescue of an injured hiker between Towers 1 and 2 of the Palm Springs aerial tram. However, courtesy of some fancy helicopter flying by Riverside Sheriff's pilots, and a bit of winch work by Lee Arneson and Chad Marler of RMRU, the subject was quickly extricated and Lee and Chad deposited in one of the tram's parking lots. We loaded them into the van and headed north. We arrived at the command post at Ballarat Campground just before dark and set up camp. I put the word campground in quotes because, well, you would just have to see it to understand. Shortly after dark, wonderful food was rolled out and a briefing was held for all the teams. The big search, being planned and run by the Inyo Sheriff's Office, was being done as an OS search. OS means the California Office of Emergency Services and is a state-coordinated mutual aid arrangement which allows for the bringing in of additional resources, which in this case meant additional search teams. The mission plan was to begin first thing Saturday morning, December 5th, inserting a variety of teams via a pair of borrowed Homeland Security helicopters at 3 locations, comprising 2 search areas, Alpha and Bravo. Reportedly, the cost of the helicopter operation was being covered by the German embassy, but I haven't verified that. Landing zone, LZ, Bravo was adjacent to the spot the remains were found by Lay and I just over 3 weeks earlier. Teams inserted in this area would be doing a detailed search of the upper alluvial fan and also the canyons running north, eventually moving back down to Anvil Canyon and westerly out to the trailhead at Willow Spring. From there they would be picked up and transported to a secondary command post operating at the Stone Cabin. The other 2 LZs, Alpha 1 and Alpha 2, were about 4 miles further to the south of the Bravo LZ. Teams inserted at these locations were to search southerly to the boundary of the China Lake facility, then turn back north and search the 3 possible southerly routes down from where the remains were found and continue to the Bravo LZ. All teams would camp for the night there, as additional water was being placed at that location. The teams assigned to the Alpha LZs would then exit via the same route Lay and I had used, the shortest route at around 11 miles. Radio communication was facilitated by helicopter placement of a radio repeater on the top of Needle Peak. Any evidence found was to be flagged with surveyor's tape, photographed, marked with GPS and left in place for later retrieval by Inyo Sheriff's forensic staff. This mission, challenging in itself, had 2 unusual aspects. First, while we were being inserted by helicopters, we had to walk out on our own. And it was a long walk. Second, our departure point was on the other side of the Panamint Mountain Range from where we arrived with our vehicle, requiring a 120-mile vehicle shuttle. The ground search teams were typically composed of 3 individuals, however there were also 3 trained cadaver dogs. The dog teams consisted of a dog, its handler, and a second individual to carry additional water and supplies. In all, about 27 people and 3 dogs were in the field actively searching, and perhaps another dozen personnel were involved in running the command posts, driving and other support operations. Search teams represented included Inyo SAR, CLMRG, RMRU, San Bernardino Desert Rescue, Calaveras County SAR and DVNP. This was quite an impressive search given the constraints it had to operate under. It was a cold night in Ballarat, but early next morning we were packed and ready to go. I was assigned to the Easterly Alpha Area LZ, as part of a team consisting of myself and two of my RMRU teammates, Lee Arneson and Pete Carlson. The first helicopter out carried the radio repeater, and the second helicopter carried Lee and Pete. During the first flights of the day, the helicopters had extra fuel, so their carrying capacity was limited. I went out on the third helicopter flight, along with Leigh Walker, a dog and his handler. Leigh and the dog handler were a dog team assigned to operate out of our LZ. After a wild flight down low, through the canyons, note to readers, if you ever get a chance to fly with US Customs pilots, do it. We were dropped in a spot that was about as close to the middle of nowhere as I've ever been. We were only about 1/2 miles north of the China Lake military border, so we decided to leave our heavy packs at the LZ, and head south with just the basics to do some searching. I was especially happy to be in this location as the topography seemed to funnel 2 of the 3 probable southerly routes into the large wash that lay before us. So Lee, Pete and I went south, and Leigh and his dog handler went off in whatever direction the dog felt like. After about an hour we reached the China Lake NWC border, seeing nothing other than an intriguing old beer can, which we retrieved as a possible clue. Out there on the vast slope there were no signs to be seen telling us of the China Lake military boundary at our feet, only a line on our GPS displays. We did see an old rock cairn that we suspect was used to mark the boundary of the military base, but there were no fences, no signs, no nothing. Not a sign of human imprint anywhere. Further south, I could see the hills of the Epsom Salt Works Jerry, and I had been at only a short time earlier. As we looked out over the vast area in front of us, comprising the China Lake property, I was surprised to note it was not possible to see the Wingate airfield from anywhere along this route. That meant if the Germans had come this way, they would not have seen a single piece of human construction to draw them in a specific direction. They literally could have gone anywhere. And from where we stood, anywhere looked pretty damn large. Seeing nothing, we turned back north and reluctantly started the long uphill climb back to our packs and onto the planned camp at the Bravo LZ. Our task along the way was to search the easterly drainage of the upper alluvial area, what I had labeled S3. Almost the entire upper area drained down through the very large wash we were traveling up. If there were any clues to be found here, it was likely they would have been churned to oblivion. We arrived at the Bravo LZ at 4 p.m., just as it was starting to get rather cold. We knew that there was a major winter storm forecast to hit the area in a few more days, but it seemed like the temperature was dropping well in advance. It was good to see all the others at the camp, as we had been on our own most of the day. It was even better to see the pallet of water and energy drinks. As a point of reference, my teammate, Pete Carlson, an adventurer and climber all his life, has traveled to exotic places all over the world. As we were out there, he remarked to me, "This is the most remote place I've ever been." That pretty much sums it up. Before it got dark, a few of us had a quick look around to see what had changed at the site since Leigh and I had last been there. It seemed like whoever had been there after us to collect evidence had done a good job, as there was little to be found. I say seemed because as we looked a little closer, we suddenly noted a number of other scattered skeletal pieces on the cliff and off to the side. Clearly there was more here. At the team's briefing that evening at the Bravo LZ, it was decided all the team members present at the Bravo LZ would take a couple of hours in the morning to scour the immediate area and hillside before departing the area around 9:30 or 10 p.m. We knew we had an 11-mile trek out, so we didn't want to linger too long. That night was an amazingly cold night. This being Death Valley, many of us brought summer bags, sleeping bags comfortable down to perhaps 30. Combined with the shelter of a tent, that should have kept us reasonably comfortable. I say should have, because it most certainly didn't. Personally, I spent a cold and wretched night thinking about the new tent I needed to buy. The next morning, Sunday, December 6th, someone with a thermometer reported it was 19. As we poured water from the cache into our pack's water bladders, it started flash freezing and turned to slush before our eyes. Great way to start the day. The cold temps made the heat-generating act of walking around the hillside quite pleasant and welcome. Beyond that, it was very useful, as numerous additional remains were found and marked. I was a little chagrined, as I had passed through this very area as I hurried down from the saddle to connect back with Leigh after he found the site. A good example of tunnel vision. Anyway, the hillside was now ablaze in fluorescent red tape streamers. As I looked across the hillside and saw all the orange shirts methodically moving across it, I felt a huge sense of satisfaction for 2 reasons. First, I think the Germans' families would be touched to see all the interest in their missing relatives even after all these years. The people out here had all displayed intense dedication to find and bring the Germans back. And second, some of those folks on the hill were on the original search and it was closure for them too. Finally, it was nearing 10 a.m. and it was time to depart. We were warned via radio that the storm had moved up and was now expected to hit that night, so we were all maybe a bit more eager than usual to leave. Some of the Bravo teams had already left, heading due north to Anvil Canyon, before turning westerly to exit. They would be checking a couple of canyons on the way. The rest of us, mostly from the Alpha area LZs, were taking a more direct route and headed up and across the alluvial fan to the northwest, to where Lay and I had camped earlier. From there we dropped into the canyon that would take us most of the way towards Anvil Canyon. But to save distance, before we reached Anvil Canyon we veered off to the left, and headed cross-country until we dropped into Anvil Canyon at a point almost where the van had been located. Lee, Pete, Lay and I seemed to be toward the front of the groups, and reached the head of the canyon as the wind started to pick up to gale force. Wonderfully for us, there was a 4WD waiting to take us to the command post at the stone cabin. Reaching the cabin, we found food, hot drinks and Deputy Winkler, probably in that order of importance. The Inyo Sheriff's Office had a fantastic setup going there which was welcomed immensely by all those coming out of the cold. Following a debriefing, and dumping of GPS logs and camera memories, we were cleared to leave. Well, that's the way it was supposed to have worked. The RMRU team vehicle was a 2WD van that could only make it as far in as Warm Spring, which is where it was left. I caught the first shuttle back down the 12 miles or so to the van, along with a number of packs, to prepare for departure. After about an hour and a half, I saw lights coming and it was the rest of the RMRU team in shuttles and knew it was time to leave. Not exactly. They informed me that we would have to wait a while longer, as Lay was out on a rescue. Huh? Rescue? It turned out one of the Bravo teams, a team of 4, had one of their members suddenly fall ill in the field, possibly the flu, and were moving slowly. They reported to the command post that they were about a mile from the trailhead, and could use some help carrying the gear of the sick individual that last mile out. So Lay and Lee of RMRU volunteered to drive with a ranger down to the trailhead, hike into the team and help carry out the gear. But by the time they reached the trailhead at Anvil Canyon, it was becoming obvious something was wrong with the team's reported position. An exchange of GPS coordinates revealed the truth. They were about 6 miles down Anvil Canyon from the trailhead, and headed in the wrong direction. This was now a potentially serious situation. It was dark, with the storm coming in, and the team had to be extracted ASAP. But with one very sick individual, they wouldn't be able to cover that amount of distance after an already long day. The ranger, who was driving a military-style Humvee, received special permission from DVNPHQ to enter the wilderness in the vehicle, travel down Anvil Canyon, and extract the team. Lay had gone along since he was very familiar with those areas of the canyon, as well as having the GPS tracks. So finally after another hour and a half, Lay arrived at the RMRU van with the ranger with a good rescue accomplished. For RMRU the DV search was nicely bookended between 2 other rescue missions. It was a long drive home, and we didn't reach our Hemet base until 12:30 a.m. Monday morning, after which we unpacked and headed off our respective ways. It had been the plan of the Inyo Sheriff's Office to send a helicopter in the next day to extract the additional remains and evidence we had found and marked so well. But the intense storm coming in was expected to dump snow on the area, making retrieval impossible for perhaps a week. Because all this well-marked material would be sitting there unprotected in the interim, the sheriff strongly urged all of us to keep all of the weekend's events as confidential as possible until they could retrieve the material. Considering the buzz over the case and the discussions happening on various internet forums, it seemed like more than a reasonable request and we were all happy to comply. It turned out the forensics people weren't able to get back to the site until December 29th, so keeping a lid on the information turned out to be a very good idea. On March 8, 2010, the Sierra Wave news outlet in Bishop reported that the Inyo Sheriff's Office had so far failed to positively ID the remains recovered. Whether exposure had deteriorated them to the extent no viable DNA could be recovered. Forensically, all that could be said was that the remains included the bones on an adult male and an adult female. No conclusive evidence of the children had been found and that more searching would be required. By the time the news of non-progress had come out in early March, I was becoming quite frustrated. I really wanted closure to this case so I could move on to other interesting things. But as long as there remained loose ends, I felt my mind constantly being pulled back to the puzzle. So on March 23, I found myself back at the site, all by myself, on a day hike. It didn't start out to be that way, but that's how it ended up. I had found the hike in via Anvil Canyon and Squaw Spring to be a pretty awful experience and had been interested in finding an alternative route. There's an old, blocked-off road that runs southerly from Barker Ranch to Wingate Wash that caught my eye. There's also a saddle southerly of Needle Peak that provides a relative low point to head east from this old road into the upper alluvial plain where the Germans were found. Finally, between the road and the saddle there's an obscure spring, SPS 006, which might be able to provide water. My plan was to get out of the house by 4:30 a.m. and drive via Trona and Ballarat to Barker Ranch and do a day hike from Barker Ranch to the spring to check out the water situation. If there was water, I brought along a lot of empty 2-liter bottles to fill for a water cache placed either at the saddle, or below it on the easterly side, towards the Germans for future trips. All the while I was planning on checking the route for viability. I tried not to dwell on how ugly the trip could become if I had to haul a couple of gallons of water up an unknown canyon. By 8:30 a.m. I had reached Barker Ranch, the starting point. It was my first time here and was suitably creepy, especially solo. I knew the Myers Ranch was adjacent, and sitting on the road I wanted to take in. I also knew that Myers Ranch was still private property, and I wished to avoid trespassing. I was able to find the property boundaries on a BLM land use website and plotted a course around it, skirting the property to the north, then dropping back to rejoin the road once east of Myers Ranch. It was a little bit of a pain, but worked okay. It wasn't until well after I did that route that I found out this was the area Manson and his buddies buried some as yet undiscovered bodies. Glad I didn't know that at the time. I made good time and reached the spring about 11 a.m. It turned out the spring was pretty poor. Very low flow, and I'd expect it to be at a maximum that time of year, so it would only be getting worse. But I was able to pump about 2 liters, which I viewed as a reserve I could carry for the day. This gave me some options I was weighing in my mind. Leaving the spring I headed east and upward to the saddle to check out the route. It was really bad. Fortunately I wasn't loaded down with a lot of water, so I reached the saddle just after noon. Looking at my GPS showed the German site was only 2 miles away to the southeast, in a non-possible straight line, of course. Given I had a relatively light day pack with extra water, I figured I had just enough time to make the site, spend no more than an hour there, and get back to Barker Ranch by dark. So off I went. Kids, don't try this at home. Since I was approaching the site from a somewhat different direction, I began searching as I approached, but found nothing new. I was interested in how good a job the sheriff's staff did in retrieving items on December 29th, and it was really very good. There wasn't a sign of bones anywhere, and almost no evidence of any sort of visitation. There were just a few bits of surveyor tape flagging and some brush, but there wasn't anything obvious there. I did notice that all the new spring growth now present made it very difficult to see around the base of shrubs. I was getting close to my must-leave time and starting to pack up near the area the wallet was found when I saw a glint on the ground. It was a pair of Bausch & Lomb Killer Loop sunglasses, somewhat crushed and with the lenses missing. They were very hard to see. In fact, when I went to my pack and returned with my camera and measure, I had trouble finding it again. I thought about bringing them back, but figured it best to flag the spot and leave the glasses in place to be retrieved by some future official search team. Again, I finished that and was preparing to leave, when about 10 feet away I saw a couple of cards in the dirt. They were smart cards for a German health insurance plan, one with Cornelia's name and the other with Max's name. As I took more pictures I was really having second thoughts about leaving this stuff, as I was flagging it very visibly. And I wasn't certain if there would be a team back on site anytime soon. But I flagged a rock and prepared to leave it. Finally, I was past my departure time and had my pack on. As I bent over to pick up one of my hiking poles, there was a glint on the ground right under my nose. It was a set of keys. My first thought was that they might be the van keys, but on closer inspection they looked more like European house keys. Now I was really in a quandary. There were now some significant items accumulated here. I literally paced around for 5 or 10 minutes trying to decide whether to leave it all or take it into the Inyo sheriff. Given that I had marked things really well, they would be wonderful souvenirs should anyone else manage to find the area. On the other hand, it was evidence in a case under investigation and should really be handled by professionals. I finally made a judgment call and decided that if any other hiker had found the stuff they would have picked it up, carted it out and given it to a ranger. This way the sheriff would at least have context photos showing the items in place and know that they were handled with care. So the items were carefully wrapped in my jacket and stowed in my pack. Being that far out there solo, even with good gear, plenty of water and a personal locator beacon, is still a sphincter tightening experience. It feels like being on the far side of the moon. And always in the back of my mind is the knowledge that if something goes wrong out here, the consequences could be considerable. I was in the middle of a harsh reminder of that. So I was quite happy to leave. I made it back to my truck a bit after 6 p.m., managed to get out of Goler Wash before dark and home around 10:30 p.m. It was one long day. The hiking round trip was 17 miles, with most of it cross-country travel. Not something I'd recommend highly. I don't think the route I used is especially useful. While it may be shorter, there are significant altitude gains and losses. Besides, it really sucks. The route in via Anvil Canyon and Squaw Spring simply just sucks, so it's preferable. As the season progressed, I knew it would soon be too warm in the area to safely explore it, but there was still a mystery to be solved. What happened to the kids, and just how did the Germans get to the location they ended up? I knew that two of the possible routes into the upper area, what I had taken to calling N1 and N2, had been thoroughly explored and no evidence of the Germans' passage had been found. But N3 was supposed to have been covered by the team that ended up getting sick, lost and requiring assistance during the big search, so it never really was examined carefully. This seemed like a good candidate for a last exploration before warmer temperatures arrived and the weather door slammed shut. I enlisted one of my RMRU teammates, Pete Carlson, to join in the fun. Pete has a sick idea of what's fun. The idea was to arrive at the Anvil Canyon trailhead and spend the night, hike in and spend the night near the head of N3, then exit the area and return home. Pete and I got to the trailhead for Anvil Canyon on the evening of Thursday, April 15th and spent the night there. We got up early and managed to get started down the trail about 6:45 a.m. on Friday morning. Since there was no water on this route, we carried about 8 or 9 liters each. The idea was that we would each leave a couple liters at the junction of Anvil Canyon and N3 for pickup on the return the next day. We wanted to minimize our water load as we climbed the N3 canyon, as it was pretty heavy. We were very fortunate to have tuned into the burro way of thinking and were able to stay almost entirely on well-defined burro trails past the van site, past the bottle bush, all the way to the N3 junction. This saved us a lot of energy and we made excellent time. I captured the track on my GPS to use on the way out. Since it was a good, or rather bad, uphill slog, knowing where the burro trails were would help a lot, so the GPS track was valuable information. One change I noticed from previous trips was an abundance of spring vegetation. This included vast swaths of yellow wildflowers. While scenic, they not only obscured the ground when searching, they made the burro trails much harder to follow. Still, the flowers were pretty spectacular. By 9:30 a.m. we had already turned south up N3 and cached our water. Looking over the area, it seemed like N3 would be an obvious choice for someone wanting to head south. The slope is fairly gentle, and it gives the appearance of reaching a crest in the distance. N1 and N2 just aren't as obvious, and someone wouldn't know they are there without a topo map. As we headed up N3, we came upon a number of small cliff faces on the east side which we checked out. In the morning they would have provided shade and we were hoping to find a dropped fluid container. While N3 is fairly wide, the wash in it is not large and the most desirable route is pretty plain to see. Pete and I moved up along both sides of this obvious route. The only thing we came across was a fragment of bone that seemed to be too large to be anything but burrow. We also could clearly see the green clump of trees at Squaw Spring off to the west. The travel up N3 was turning out to be very pleasant, and I began to see how the Germans could have made it in as far as they did. This route was much easier than any other I had been on. I knew that about 2.2 miles up N3 there was a drop-off into another canyon that drained the upper alluvial area down into Anvil Canyon further east. I had identified that as a possible campsite for this adventure, as it was in the main area we wanted to search. I had also spotted another potential campsite a further 0.4 miles south, if we had energy to get that far. As we gained the head of N3 the canyon widened and flattened, and we could see the drop-off coming up. We got to the edge at 11 a.m. It was an OMG moment. The drop down into the canyon below seemed huge. Worse than that, the terrain to the south was a maze of colorful mudhills cut by deep ravines. We knew, as happy possessors of a USGS topo map, that the wash below us would eventually lead to the upper alluvial fan. But everything our eyes told us ran counter to that. It looked like it was just vanishing off into the mountain to the east. It seemed inconceivable that an inexperienced party, tired and with 2 children, would risk a descent into this canyon below with no apparent hope of it continuing south. So we were more than happy to bypass it and continue south to our planned campsite. Then we saw the shinies. Something was glittering below in the wash, like glass. Unable to resolve what it was with binoculars, it meant a personal visit to the bottom was necessary. So we dropped our packs on the rim and started down. When we reached the bottom, we were very surprised. The depth of the canyon was something of an optical illusion. Not bad at all. But without actually doing the descent, we would not have known. The shinies turned out to be very large flakes of a calcite-like crystal, which were littering the wash. Spoofed again. Returning back up to our packs, we proceeded south via the most logical route around the convoluted hills. It's not like there were a lot of options. We found if we stayed a bit to the west, we could remain out of the mudhill area, although we were still forced to up and down small ravines. If this was indeed the route the Germans had taken, it clearly would have turned into a nightmare. We reached our intended campsite, on a saddle above the mud hills, around noon. It was becoming obvious to us that even though the area we had intended to search when drawn on a map was somewhat large, the crazy terrain was limiting potential through routes to only a few areas. We felt that the only two realistic routes to the south was a higher one to the west, which we were currently on, or along a well-defined wash through the mud hills. We decided to drop our packs at the campsite and continue south with minimal supplies along the higher route, then return to the camp via the mud hills. Losing the heavy, water-laden packs made travel much easier, and we quickly reached the northerly edge of the upper alluvial fan. We could see the knoll, which became the final resting spot for the Germans, about 1.1 miles away, almost directly south. We turned easterly and began to drop down into what we observed to be the best choice of washes for returning back toward our camp area. At that point we spotted something unexpected. In the wash below us was an odd-looking rock pile with a post in it. My first thought was a mining claim, but I had never heard of any mining activity in the area. And old claim markers are usually just rock cairns. Could it be a grave? Not knowing, we quickly dropped down for a closer look. The post was an old 4 inches by 4 inches wood post, with the remains of red paint around the top area. It was set fairly well into the soil, with large rocks around it. The rocks weren't holding it up, the soil was. In the slope behind it, there appeared to be evidence of a small prospect, so it looked like it was some sort of prospect marker. Set on the rock pile was an empty amber bush beer bottle, which didn't look all that old. Was the bottle left by the Germans? No, it wasn't. Post-trip examination of the symbols and markings on the bottom of the bottle showed that it was manufactured by the Thatcher Manufacturing Company. The company ceased operations in 1985, thus the bottle had to be older than 1985. So while the marker appears odd, it must be associated with some type of mining activity. We did come across a few very old rusted cans and a couple of wood pieces nearby, so there may have been a campsite there prior to the area becoming part of the Death Valley NP in 1994. Leaving the mystery post, Pete and I continued down the colorful washes until we returned to the area beneath our campsite. At one point we passed what we called the psychotic rattlesnake. Now we never exactly saw this sucker, we were at least 100 feet away, a good distance when around rattlesnakes. Yet this guy set off his rattle like he was on speed, and wouldn't shut up until we were way down the canyon. After a painful, but short, climb, we reached our gear around 2:30 p.m. We were now faced with the situation of having covered most of the area we felt needed to be covered, yet it was still early in the day. It was going to be a long time until nightfall. After a bit of discussion, we decided we had enough energy left to make it back out to the truck before nightfall. Part of our optimism was having the burrow trails mapped out in my GPS, which would save a lot of energy on the return. So after shoveling in more food and guzzling down our now abundant water, back north we headed. Even though we were descending, the temperature had gone up and we were now in the heat of the day. It was probably in the mid-80s. Since we no longer needed to stop by our water cache at the Anvil Canyon/N3 junction, we were able to veer to the NW directly to Anvil Canyon and save some distance. Connecting back to the burrow trails along Anvil Canyon really saved our bacon, as we were both pretty beat. We arrived back at the truck just before 6 p.m., probably more dead than alive. It looks like the total distance for the day was 19 miles, most of which was with a full pack. Not a good idea, but then so many of my experiences in this area have turned out not to be good ideas. After cleaning up a bit, we made it back to the main valley floor just as it was getting dark and blasted off for home. After having hiked the N3 route and taking in the topography, I think it's most probable the Germans used N3 to head south. From the perspective of Anvil Canyon it appears an obvious choice, and is the route you would see from the vantage point of the Bottle Bush. It's not until you are over 2 miles in and heavily committed to the choice that you discover about 1.5 miles of mudhill hell awaits. But somehow the Germans made it through that, since we know where they ended up. There probably isn't much benefit in additional searching in the N3 area as Pete and I covered it fairly well. About a month later, in the first week of May, 2010, I received a call from Deputy Winkler with some good news. Further forensic work was able to find some viable DNA deep in one of the recovered bones. They were able to match that DNA to Egbert with a very high level of confidence. Unfortunately, no further DNA progress had been made on the female skeletal remains, and no evidence of child bones had yet been found. They were still out there, somewhere. After the N3 hike, the temperature door closed for the summer and gave me a chance to think about things. It bothered me that the kids hadn't been found, and it seemed they should be somewhere close. The problem lay in getting into the area for long enough to do a decent search. After some thought, I maybe came up with a way. The plan was to wait until the weather cooled, and then do a day hike into stage water for a later, more ambitious trip. The idea was to car camp at the Anvil Canyon trailhead, then proceed in for a day hike to Squaw Spring. At Squaw Spring, fill up a number of jugs with water, then proceed up towards the plateau and cache the water for the future trip. At that time, the water could be picked up and used during the search. Studying topo maps, I had also found a new route up to the plateau that might be easier than the route Lay and I had done, as it climbed a few hundred feet less. It was also not too far from Squaw Spring. It was a very narrow canyon that came off N1 and went to the plateau. This seemed to be a good spot for a water cache. I set up the trip for October 30, 2010 as the weather was cooling. I had spent several months collecting 2-liter soda bottles and now had enough for a 10-gallon cache. I figured it would be enough water for 4 people for 2 nights up on the plateau. Pete Carlson was going to join me, as he had a good time on the N3 hike. He always scares me a bit, as he can hike me into the ground. And for at least a few miles, we would both be carrying about 40 pounds of water each. The weather in the days before our planned trip was pretty dicey, but was clearing. We decided to go anyway, and we got rained on as we spent the night at the Anvil Canyon trailhead while the wind howled. We started in anyway, looking behind us at the ominous clouds over Manly Peak. But by about 10 a.m. it had cleared and turned really nice. In many ways this was the easiest trip in. I now had good GPS tracks with all the burrow trails marked, making travel much better. And for the climb up to Squaw Spring and on into the N1 Canyon, I had worked out a GPS path with the topo maps I called a minimum energy route. It was one that slowly climbed the contours and avoided the up and down climbs caused by all the ravines. No wasted effort. It was the sort of thing you can do with a GPS that's much harder with a paper map. Reaching Squaw Spring, we headed toward where Lay and I had got our water the year before. No water, it was dry. That was a problem. So Pete and I spent a while looking around, and a few hundred feet down canyon, we found some small pools in the heavy brush, adequate for our needs. So we each set upon pumping with 2 pumps. Ever pump 5 gallons with a stupid backpacking filtration pump? It's a pain in the ass, and takes a very long time. After an hour, I was beat, but we had finished. It was time to head out. Putting on a pack that was now 40 pounds heavier was disturbing. It brought my total pack weight to over 60 pounds. I needed both trekking poles to stabilize myself on the rough terrain. We headed southeast to N1, slowly climbing. Eventually we reached the side canyon that was going to take us up to the top. It was a small, nondescript thing on our left that we would have normally gone right past but for the GPS. We turned up it. It was narrow and climbed like crazy. But it was quite scenic. For some reason, I was having a terrible time keeping up with Pete, and was just getting exhausted. I could only climb a short ways and had to stop. I figured it was all the weight, but I had carried this sort of load before. The original idea was to put the water another 1.5 miles onto the plateau, all downhill, but I was in really bad shape. I was going to be lucky to make it to the top of the crest. Pete generously offered to take one of my 5 gallons, and that helped a lot. In time, I topped out at the crest, pretty much toast. It was a very scenic spot, and we could see the small ravine running downhill towards the southeast that would eventually lead to the search area. But for now we had gone in as far as I could and needed to bury the water. This turned out to be the sort of thing that when planning it all out at home, sounded like a fine idea. Having unloaded our packs, creating a large pile of water bottles, and looking around at the rocky terrain, we now started asking, how the hell were we going to bury all these suckers? We didn't want to just pile rock on them, as we were unsure exactly when we'd be back. Wandering around a bit, we found some areas of loose, wind-blown sand that looked diggable. So we set to it with our hand shovels. About an hour later, we had them reasonably covered. Leaving our valuable buried treasure, we turned around and headed back. It was a long slog and I didn't feel as good as I thought I would, having got rid of all the extra weight. By the time we reached the trailhead we had put in 14 miles for the day. Along the way, between the pack weight and the nasty volcanic terrain, I had torn up my boot soles to the point they needed resoling. This meant I'd have to hustle to do that before we headed back for the real search. This trip again underscored something to me: it's a very difficult area to get into. With the water safely, if arduously, in place up on the edge of the plateau, it was time to start planning for a serious search trip. Pete Carlson was of course on board, because Pete loves this sort of crazy adventure. Adding to the insanity was Paul Caraher and Patrick McCurdy, more RMRU members freelancing. We set our date for November 13th and I whipped up the following oh-so-pretty plan. The plan showed where the water was placed, GPS tracks of previous trips I'd been involved with, and what looked to be a reasonable area to set up camp. It was broken down into 4 potential areas that hadn't been previously covered, and could offer some opportunities. The area boundaries weren't hard and fast, and much would depend on what the terrain looked like when we saw it, i.e., making it up as we go along. Area A, the southerly slope area just west of where Connie's remains were found, and was my understanding of the location of Egbert's remains. However, not much was found. This area, and possibly slightly further west, could turn up more clues to Egbert. Area B, I had a strong hunch this was the area the Germans first came onto the plateau, on the way to their final spot. Pete and I explored a bit of it previously on our N3 hike, but didn't go further east as we didn't think it was possible to get to the plateau that way. Turns out the topography acts as a natural funnel around the east-west ridgeline. The idea would be to look for any traces of the Germans' passage, bottles, personal effects, etc. Area C, if the party had even a general sense of where the van was, the children may have started out in this direction after the parents succumbed. The area appeared to be reasonable terrain and had never been searched. Area D, I had no special insight into Area D, other than when looking at the GPS tracks it was obvious the area hasn't been covered and isn't far from where the Germans ended up. In the large Decemberos search there was a party, including some RMRU members, that headed north from Connie's site and traveled directly to Anvil Canyon. They would have passed through the areas between B and C, which is why I omitted that area. So on Friday, November 12th, we made our way to Death Valley and ended up at the Anvil Canyon trailhead late in the day to spend the night. The next morning we headed in. Following the burro trails was now second nature, and we made good time. Why not, since heading in is running downhill? Eventually we turned south and into the N1 Canyon, this time being able to bypass Squaw Spring. A bit after noon we reached the crest where the water was unmolested. I noticed I was still having trouble with the climb up the side canyon to the crest, breathing very hard. After loading up our water supplies, we started downhill to the southeast, in the ravine that would take us out on the plateau, and to the yard we planned on camping. While going down the canyon, we spread out and searched as we traveled, but there wasn't anything of interest. As we reached a point near where Pete and I had seen the mystery post, we turned south, climbed up out of the ravine and started to look for a likely campsite. Unfortunately, the entire area was rocky and cobbled, not an inviting place to pitch tents. And if the wind picked up, it would be brutally exposed. We finally found a decent, if narrow spot, in a little ravine. There was enough of a sandy bottom that we could put our tents, but they all had to be done in a line. It was only about 3 p.m. by the time we finished setting up camp, which left us time for a search. We thought we'd head northeast and do Area B, where I thought the Germans had perhaps first reached the plateau, then swing around sort of clockwise and head back to camp. We spread out laterally and did a variant of a line search. It's good we had GPS units along, as our camp promptly vanished behind us and there was little indication of where it was. After an hour and a half, we felt we had covered Area B pretty well, so we headed on back for the night. The next morning we started early and headed south to the main site. Paul and Patrick had never been there and wanted to see what it was like. And I wanted to do some real serious, detailed searching where I had found the items on my day hike from Ballarat. It seemed unlikely I had stumbled upon all that there was. Patrick stayed with me looking around for anything missed, and Pete and Paul headed up to the saddle to the southwest, which we referred to as S2, staying in touch by radio. Paul explored the saddle area and Pete pushed quite a bit to the south, looking for any evidence of bottles or trash. None was to be found, however. Meanwhile, despite my intense efforts, nothing new was to be found at the main site. It was now clean. Eventually we regrouped and did a westerly swing through portions of Area D, then northerly towards camp. Along the way, there was an isolated hill we had gone by several times before as we had entered and exited the area, but never had the time or energy to climb it. This time, we did. It gave us a full panoramic view of the entire plateau. We could also see a good hunk of Area C, and what we saw suggested it wasn't worth the effort to search. It was the sort of thing that looked like a plausible area on a map, but then upon seeing the actual terrain you realize no one would purposely head that way when there were obviously better routes. So Area C was a bust. Reaching camp, we had a discussion. We already had covered the most obvious areas we could. Certainly we didn't cover it all, but as always, we used the topography to fine-tune where we actually searched. The idea of just randomly picking areas to walk around through didn't sound especially appealing to me, and I had a certain vague anxiousness and a desire to get out of the area. Part of it was that I wasn't exactly feeling 100%. So we quickly broke down our camp and started the hell out of there. We knew that if we hustled, we could be home in our beds by late that night. As I was hiking out, I realized that absent any new, substantial data, this was going to be my last trip into here. It's such a remote place that there's always a sense of risk and exposure being there. And to me, it just wasn't worth it anymore. We had covered all the logical areas, and a whole lot that weren't. What we had left was a whole load of nuttin'. It was quite a letdown not finding evidence of the kids, but in the absence of any new clues, the only thing left to do was a line search of the entire plateau, something out of the question. We ended our downhill run when we reached Anvil Canyon, and started our slog back up to the vehicles at the trailhead. This is a slog I'd had done before, and it's always annoying. But this time it was worse. Much worse. I was lagging behind, almost exhausted, with elevated pulse. I thought perhaps I was coming down with a flu, but there was no fever, just weakness. I thought I had been eating plenty, but Patrick talked me into taking some of his goo packs. In about 15 minutes I felt much better, and with the help of strategically timed packets of goo, was able to make it out of there. After our return, my pulse was still highly elevated, enough that I thought it was time to see the doc. Turned out I was experiencing the onset of Graves' disease, a friggin' chick thing that hardly ever happens to guys, and my thyroid was locked into crazy overdrive. My metabolism was such that I needed to increase my food intake by about 50% to avoid hypoglycemia. This is what was kicking my ass on the trail, as well as on the water placement hike with Pete. It was also the cause of the elevated pulse rate and the nonspecific anxiety I was feeling. Had I known what was going on, there would have been no way I'd chance a trip into that area in this condition. As I write this, a year and a half later, the Graves has been taken care of and I'm back at 100%. Actually, that's not right. I'm better than what would have been 100% back then. I was able to dump a lot of weight while getting the Graves under control and am now at a fitness level equal to where I was about 30 years ago. So it's worked out pretty well. But I'm still not interested in going back there. So that's where the story of the Germans wraps up. We didn't find the kids, but we cracked a pretty good missing persons case and brought closure to some families. Up until this point, the families never knew what happened to their loved ones, and were left to the devices of their imaginations. And that's usually not a good thing. And we had some really outstanding adventures while doing some good, something I'll always remember. I learned some valuable lessons, such as finding human remains in the back county subjects you to all sorts of bureaucratic craziness. My advice is to just phone in the GPS coordinates anonymously, then run like hell, a lesson I'd end up applying in the not too distant future. So, this was the end. No. Turned out I wasn't exactly right. In previous discussions I had with Deputy Winkler of the Inyo Sheriff's Office, he had mentioned that during the search a team shortly after leaving the site came across an interesting bone, took photos and GPS cords of its location. Since it was a little distance from the main site, when the helicopter team went in to recover all the flagged remains, this item was missed. This was unfortunate, as the photo suggested it could be a child's clavicle, but it was far from certain without actually seeing it. In planning our assorted trips into the area, I kept Deputy Winkler informed about what we were up to and our intentions. On 2 occasions I suggested that since we'd be in the area, we'd be happy to swing by the coordinates noted, see if there was anything to it and take more photos without disturbing the bone. Each time, he just ignored what I said and the discussion moved on. I decided not to press the issue and chalked it up to the usual one-way flow of information that I've experienced working with most agencies. They are quick to accept whatever you have to offer, but always seem to find reasons not to share what they have. I understand why this happens, but I don't like it much. On December 6, 2010 I received a phone call from Deputy Winkler. About a week prior, about 2 weeks after our final trip, Inyo County took a helicopter out to the mystery coordinates and dropped off 4 or 5 people for an overnight stay. They covered that area and found some children's shoes, as well as some small bones, possibly of the children. These bones, as well as those presumed to be Cornelia's, were going to be sent to an advanced research facility in the Midwest to attempt DNA recovery. That process was expected to take 3 months. I asked about when they might be releasing info to the public and he said they were having a meeting about it that afternoon to decide what to do. The case wouldn't be officially closed until DNA came back. One of the main points he wanted to get across to me was that if our motley group went back out there and found anything, the Inyo County Sheriff's Office didn't want it. He also said they had returned the personal effects to the families in Germany, and wished to do so with the bones. I asked him where they found the kids' stuff, and he said about 75 yards from the knoll. I'm inclined to think this location is BS, Winkler wasn't actually there. There had been plenty of coverage near the site, including what we did, which extended well beyond 75 yards. When Winkler first told me about the possible child's bone find he thought it was about half mile away from the site. Since it was found by a departing searcher, it would have had to have been northwest of the site, on the route to the crest. On our last trip we passed through part of that area as we headed northeast to climb a light-colored hill which the area panorama picture was taken from. He also mentioned the shoes were found north of the site, in a wash. This also sounded very odd to me, being familiar with the terrain. So I got location answers that were literally all over the landscape. So that was it, perhaps it was really all over at last. I always found Winkler to be a good guy to deal with and he did a great job running the O's search. But it felt more than a little galling that these Inyo guys had been sitting on a location for almost a year while we were busting our asses to get in and search. Had they shared their info, then perhaps things could have been brought to a closure in April. Of course then it wouldn't have been by Inyo County folks, and maybe that was important to them. There's more I could write about this, but I think I'll just shut up and let it all be. As a follow-up to preparing this narrative, on April 11, 2012 I sent an email to Karma Roper, the Public Information Officer for the Inyo County Sheriff's Office. She and I had exchanged email correspondence shortly after we first found the Germans. I said that I knew about the helicopter trip in and the recovery of some additional items and remains, but that I never saw any sort of official announcement from their office of either the recovery or any results. I asked her if any further identifications had been made. She never responded. That sort of treatment is typical of the level of professionalism I've experienced from the Inyo County Sheriff's Office. And I have taken away a very valuable lesson from it all. If I ever find myself in a dire situation in the backcountry of Inyo County and require rescue, I would crawl on bloody hands and knees over miles of jagged rock until I reached either the Kern or San Bernardino County lines. Then, and only then, would I set off my personal locator beacon or spot device. A person needs to do everything possible to maximize survival.